Hi, everyone. Just a note that we're waiting for some folks who are still coming down from the conference, so it'll probably be a few more minutes. Thanks. Bob, I think you're right there in the middle.
Okay.
You're right here. Okay.
Can't see.
Hi, I'm Lori Bader.
Sandra Jordan, USA.
Yeah, we met.
Yes.
Lori
I'm Dana
Bader.
Sutherland from Population. Hi, Dana Sutherland. Nice to meet you. Oh, great. Hi, Rebecca from Rebecca Foundation.
Oh, I'm sorry, I keep doing that wrong.
I know. I know. Oops, I guess I shouldn't scream I know into it.
Great. Well, thank you for your patience. We'll probably have a few more people who are still coming down from the conference. But hello and welcome to the Wilson Center for today's special two-part event, Talking Science, Environment, and Health Communications in a Skeptical Era. I'm Megan Parker. I'm the writer-editor for the Environmental Change and Security Program. And I'm especially pleased that this event is co-sponsored by the Environmental Communications Division of the National Communication Association, which is holding its 99th annual convention this week up in Woodley Park. Dedicated to fostering and promoting free and ethical communication, the NCA promotes the widespread appreciation of the importance of communication in public and private life, the application of competent communication to improve the quality of human life and relationships, and the use of knowledge about communication to solve human problems. So I welcome the members of the National Communication Association who are joining us here today. And I'd like to especially thank Michael Svoboda of George Washington University, who has been the driving force behind the idea of bringing the NCA here to the Wilson Center for an afternoon devoted to communicating science to policymakers. Michael will be chairing our second panel after the coffee break on climate change, skepticism, and denial. The Wilson Center, for those of you who are new, is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum dedicated to international affairs. It was established by Congress in 1968 as the formal living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who is the only president with a PhD. My program, the Environmental Change and Security Program, focuses on the links connecting environment, population health, livelihoods, and security. And I invite you all to follow our events, many of which are webcasts like this one, at wilsoncenter.org/ECSP, and also our blog, New Security Beat. Even if you are not based in DC, you can participate in our discussions by watching the webcast, which are also archived for later viewing. Our first panel, Speaking Science to Power, focuses on the art of communications in the policy sphere. Each panelist will give a short opening remarks on what they see as their role as the Director of Communications in bridging the gap between environment and health science and policymakers, and offers us some examples of the challenges and successes that they've had. If you are tweeting this event, the hashtag for the NCA conference is NCA13. You have all the participants' detailed bios, so I'll just briefly introduce them in turn. And there's one addition to this panel. Rebecca Bertram is doing double duty. She's going to be filling in for a cancellation, and on this panel, and she's also on the second panel as well. All right, so the first speaker today will be Lori Bader, who's the Director of Health Communications at the Pew Charitable Trust. And is a veteran Washington communications professional whose career spanned Capitol Hill, the executive branch, nonprofit sector, and the think tank community. Lori?
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming out on the Friday before Thanksgiving week. I'll keep my remarks very, very short. I've been a communicator all my life, not a scientist. I started out as a reporter, and my career has been so long that I remember when people used to revere science and look forward and hold scientists in high regard, and I've seen what I unfortunately perceive as a diminution of that role, especially in American society, and it's something that I regret deeply. I have done a whole bunch of communication at the intersection of policy, politics, and science. I was the political appointee as the head of public affairs at NASA during the Clinton administration, and I served a similar role at the Department of Health and Human Services during the Clinton administration. And that came after and before stints on Capitol Hill communicating for senators. They asked me to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I've faced, and I think the general challenge of communicating science to the public is to avoid the trap of dumbing it down while still capturing the popular imagination and explaining to the interested public why science is important to them and why research and discovery are important to them. And sometimes explaining policy can be a real trap. One of my greatest challenges when I was at HHS was explaining why, and this doesn't have a lot to do with science, but it sure has a lot to do with policy, why you taxpayers were going to pay Medicaid to provide the newly announced drug Viagra to Medicaid recipients because it was going to replace the mechanical devices that were available to treat the same condition beforehand. You try and get through a discussion with the press about that without a single double entendre. Just try it, I dare you. I blush today when I'm thinking about it. I spoke so slowly. I know, it's a true story, I really did. But I think another of my great challenges, and this is quite a bit about science, I was very lucky at NASA. I got there right after they fixed Hubble and right before they crashed Mars Observer, so nothing went wrong on my watch. But we had, and some of you may actually remember this, there was a controversial press conference about some of the researchers at NASA had been investigating a Martian meteorite, and they found what they thought might be evidence for very early life forms on Mars. Very controversial. They themselves were not entirely convinced of the evidence, and there was going to be a peer-reviewed paper coming out in a scientific journal, but of course the press got wind of it, and there was a whole brouhaha around it. So my idea for communicating that one, I thought, I want to give these scientists room to talk about their findings, but also room to talk about their own skepticism and the skepticism of the press, and to do it in a way that didn't belittle or dumb down their science, but at the same time amplified the fabulous interest of this story. I mean, the day that we determine that there has in fact been life on any other planet is going to be an awesome day for the species. But we weren't there yet, and I had to make sure that I maintained the excitement of the press corps around this subject without undermining the science or the skepticism at all, the appropriate skepticism in this case. So what I did was propose that we bring a skeptic onto the panel, someone who had not been part of the research, to sit there and talk to the scientists about what he believed was wrong with their research. And I think that lent the event a type of credibility that otherwise would sound like us trying to hype what was only a theory and what what was not a finding. The night before, however, things were really getting crazy, and we were trying to balance a ravening press corps who were looking for the nuggets of news about this with the fact that the scientists who had actually done the work were camping somewhere in Utah, I think it was, and couldn't be reached. So I finally had the administrator of NASA come out with a statement, and it was, I can tell you, the only time that I have ever used the phrase "little green men" in a statement. and the quote all over the country the next day was, "We are not talking about little green men here." So anyway, that's just by the by. I'm often discouraged at the beating science has taken in recent years, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues here on the panel how they address it, and your questions as to how you want to see it addressed.
Well, thank you very much, Lori, and thanks for reminding us that skepticism can also be appropriate, and in talking about science is not always a bad word. Next is Bob Deans, who's the Associate Director of Communications for the Natural Resources Defense Council and a veteran reporter of many years before that. Bob?
Thank you so much, and thank you, Lori. Lori, what is Viagra? Never mind.
Kind of a new thing.
We'll take it offline. I can't help but noting that 50 years ago, almost to this very minute, I was sitting in my 4th grade class in elementary school in Richmond, Virginia, when my teacher was called on the public address system to come to the principal's office. The teacher. This didn't happen often. She left us there unattended and returned about 20 minutes later in tears, which was something else I'd never seen. And she announced to our class that President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. This was before the internet, before email, before texting, at a time when even the cell phone was a kind of a George Jetson concept that none of us expected to see in our own lifetimes. And this is how we learned about that. I say that because everybody in here who is my age or older can also remember exactly where we were and exactly what we were doing when we learned the news that President Kennedy had been shot. The reason for that is that the president is the only elected official whose job is to represent all of the American people. he is literally, or she one day, literally the human face of our government, the human face of the nation. That makes history personal. What we try to do in communicating climate change science at the NRDC is to make climate change science personal. Because when you do that, it matters to people. And until you do, it doesn't. And so some of the ways we try to do that are to travel to a ranch in Colorado, as we did summer before last, during the heart of one of the worst droughts in 50 years, and talk to a third-generation rancher whose family has been raising cattle on this land off of native pasture for decades, and see and talk to this person about what it means to have a drought that is so severe that he cannot feed his cattle, that he cannot afford to feed the cattle, that he has to liquidate his herd. Or travel to Kansas and talk to a third-generation corn farmer and see why it is that his underground aquifer no longer can produce the water needed to keep his corn alive. Or go to Appalachia and talk to the daughter and granddaughter of a coal miner about what mountaintop removal is doing to the Appalachian regions. Or go to the Chesapeake Bay and talk to an oysterman about what it means to no longer be able to get oysters out of the largest natural estuary in the nation. Or go to the Gulf of Mexico and talk to people down there about what it means to be losing 1 acre of wetlands every hour, in part because of what the oil and gas industry has been doing, in part because sea level is rising, and in part because of the way the Mississippi River has been channeled. When we can connect the dots, when we can put a human face on the dangers, the cost, and the rising risks and hazards of climate change, we tend to get people's attention. When we talk about parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere and the 14 hottest years on record since 1997, we tend to lose people's attention. What we have to do is to make this science real and understandable for people when they sit down at their kitchen table, when they look out their window, when they wander around in their own backyard. It can be done because, after all, science is the story of what is happening to our world. We just have to tell that story in a way that connects with people. And when we're able to do that, it makes a difference. Nobody expected the UN Climate Conference in Warsaw that opened week before last to produce a whole lot. After all, this is a sort of laying the groundwork for the Paris Summit in 2015, which is supposed to be about setting more ambitious carbon reduction targets by 2025. It's not a front page story. But when the delegate from the Philippines stands up and says, we have just witnessed in our country what may be the single worst typhoon ever recorded. Why? Because the waters of the Pacific Ocean in the South Philippines are some of the hottest in the world. And this was a record year for those waters in terms of heat. And it put more energy, it put more moisture into that storm. And so we can't say that that storm was a direct result of climate change. What we can say is that climate change is the field on which it played out. If it made that storm more powerful, if it put more moisture in the air, if it gave that storm more wallop, it contributed to the destruction and the loss and the grievous hardship being suffered by these people in the Philippines. And when Delegate Sanyo put that on the table, he changed the dynamic of the entire Warsaw Conference. He created a sense of urgency that before that conference lacked, because he put a human face on the disaster and the challenge and the opportunity we all have. That's what we try to do at the NRDC.
Thank you, Bob, and for that reminder that personal stories can change or affect policy. Next, we have Dilly Severin, who's the Director of Communications for Population Action International. She is also the co-chair of the International Family Planning Coalition's Communicators Group. Dilly?
Thanks, Megan, for having me. I guess PAI works on increasing access to family planning, and one of the strands of that is making the link between family planning and adapting to climate change. And whenever I say that, I think it's the most common sense yet non-intuitive issue to work on. And because of that, I see communications as really playing, four really key roles for PAI. And one is just building understanding, again, because of that sort of non-intuitive sense of family planning, climate change adaptation. Part of our role is to just start that conversation and spur that thought for people. And I think the second piece then is once you spark that idea, you need to build credibility. And I think building credibility for us has to be both in the left brain sense and in the right brain sense, right? So what is the evidence that there is a link, with numbers, with maps, with GIS, with visualization, that there is a link between helping women become more resilient to climate change by fulfilling their right to family planning. But the right brain credibility is equally as important. And that piece is bringing the voices of women to policymakers. So really through our films, through images, in really clear ways, bring them to the center of the conversation and showing policymakers that they are making these connections for themselves. So while we're having conversation and saying it's abstract, these women in Ethiopia, in Malawi, in Nepal are saying, we are seeing the connections and we want you to act on them. I think that is critical. Then I think the third piece for communications is coordination. I think a lot of the work that PAI does, we do in coalition, we do with partners. We're not going at this alone. So part of our role here is to provide wherever we can the tools and the messages so that not just we can, but our whole coalition can make the best case possible. And I think to that effect, we've often have to serve as a bridge between communities. So for example, our CEO, Suzanne, also sits on the Green Group, and then a powerhouse like the Sierra Club also sits on the International Family Planning Coalition. So that bridging function, I think, is really critical to the role of communications. And then I think the fourth piece is trying to shift the media conversation. We've had to, again, not only develop messages for our community, but through our own spokespeople, really educate the media about how the conversations around population might not be the ones they think they are, and to really educate them about how they can bring women's voices to the center of this conversation, how they can ground it in sort of the real experiences in the way that NRDC is doing. In terms of barriers, I would say, talking about issues of population, on the one hand, it's a really old issue, so people think they understand it and people think they understand the paradigm. But on the other hand, it's our job to show them that the paradigm has shifted. So we're not talking anymore about, target numbers or, trying to stop women from having children. Our conversation is about how can we fulfill their rights to choose the size of their families and then the benefits that flow from that for themselves and then for the environment and for their communities. So that continues to be a challenge. And I think flowing out of that, because it is sort of an old paradigm, many environmentalists are still afraid of talking about issues of population. They feel like it's a third rail issue. So I think it's constantly my job to open up that conversation and give them the tools that they will feel comfortable using and changing the conversation so that it's no longer stigmatized. In terms of what has worked, again, really demonstrating to our audiences, whether they're policymakers or whether we're working with advocates in country, that this is something that women are asking for. We're not imposing it. We're not coming up with some radical new agenda. Women are saying, because I can't choose how many children I want to have, it's harder for me to provide for my family. I'm walking further distances to get water. I'm seeing the environmental degradation that's happening because we're splitting up our land because we have more children than we desire. So again, bringing their voices to the conversation, showing that they are asking for this, I think has been incredibly effective. And then lastly, in terms of what has worked, I would say, again, this sense of urgency. I think, at least in the US, conversations about climate change can feel very abstract, right? Like degrees of temperature rise or parts per million. But when someone is telling you they woke up in the middle of the night and what woke them up was a flash flood and they couldn't find their baby, I mean, that urgency in that moment, I think provides the motivation to act, especially at the country level. When you bring these stories to policymakers, they feel the need to act. So thank you.
Thank you, Dilly. As somebody who also works at the intersection between different sectors, there is another gap that we should acknowledge, which is between scientists who work in different disciplines, and that's another one. So PAI's work on this area is impressive. Next is Rebecca Bertram, who's the program director for the Heinrich Boll Foundation North America. She's responsible for the foundation's Environment and Global Dialogue program, and she also manages the website on the German energy transition, which is intended to communicate to an international audience. Rebecca?
Thank you, Megan. Thanks so much for joining the conversation here. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Heinrich Böll Foundation. For many of you who don't know us, we are one of the 5 German political foundations that we have. We are political in the sense that we are affiliated with a party. Each bigger political party in Germany has its own foundation to kind of do policy think tank work and policy outreach work. We are the foundation affiliated with the German Green Party, which means that we obviously care a lot about issues that are close to the green hearts, such as energy and climate. We are an international organization. We have about 30 offices worldwide, so our outreach is truly global. I work out of the Washington, D.C. office, mostly on trying to build a transatlantic dialogue around energy and climate issues. So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the energy transition. Some of you might have heard the ambitious road that Germany, after Fukushima happened, is embarking on to reach about 80% renewable energy in the electricity sector by the middle of the century, and resulting in a 50% decrease of our energy consumption, as well as decreasing our CO2 emissions by about 95% until the middle of the century, everything while phasing out nuclear. So there is a lot of international attention to what's going on in Germany. To my knowledge, it's the only country with a strong industrial base that is going that path. So there are many lessons to be learned out of that. And out of this realization, about a year ago, we started as a foundation an international website called energytransition.de that is geared towards explaining on a regular basis of what's going on in Germany. There's a lot of information out there, and the issue is so complex that sometimes it needs to be put into perspective a little bit, and that's what we try to do. We obviously, the mothership of the website is in English, but we also have translations into Chinese, Spanish, Russian, Japanese, French, to kind of create that whole global outreach potential. I feel that Germany can serve as a test case for other countries to follow suit, and it will only be a valuable test case if Germany maintains an industrial base, and that's really at the heart of the challenge here, I think, because other countries will then say, why should we follow? It's not working. Germany is losing its international competitiveness. I don't believe that Germany has all the answers. We are at 25% renewable energy at the moment in the electricity mix, and there are a lot of challenges going forward, and Germans don't know how to do it. We're forming a new coalition government at the moment, so there's going to be many issues that need to be tackled over the next couple of years in Germany. So, but I think it serves as a case of like a learning case and getting the best practices kind of tried out and making them available to an international audience. But essentially what we're trying to do as a foundation is not focus on climate change threats, which tends to be rather negative narrative, but we try to, and that's why energy transition and the buildup of renewable energies is so important, because it tries to move it into a more positive light of what can the actual person do to be involved. And if you look at what's happening in Germany, it's fascinating because it enables ordinary citizens, farmers, rural communities to get involved in this, to collectively invest in renewable energy projects. And the way the political incentive structure is set up to actually gain money from it. So it's a valuable investment model which enables these people to see the potential in making money of renewable energies, and as a result, they get a greater economic development for the rural and local regions, which taps into the conservative message, which is one that we want to tab in. My work specifically involves tabbing this message into more conservative rural areas of what can the individual actually do to promote this development. And that's probably what I want to say.
Thank you, Rebecca. I like the story of how you use individual action to create a positive feedback loop to try to change the conversation. Next, we have Sandra Jordan, who's the Senior Technical Advisor for External Affairs at USAID, where she has worked in the Office of Population and Reproductive Health in the Global Health Bureau since September 2000. And she's also a member of the Rights and Empowerment Working Group of Family Planning 2020. Sandra?
Thanks a lot, and thanks to everyone for coming. And Lori and I actually just met, but we're bookending each other very well because I am a highly skeptical communicator working in a skeptical world and working for the entity in the United States about which people are the most skeptical. So it's a pretty challenging. I've been working in public relations in Washington since 1988. If you can't cause controversy, you can't get a headline. And that makes it very difficult because in the US government, we're not supposed to create controversy. So I actually have two stories. I just got back from the International Family Planning meeting in Addis Ababa that saw almost 4,000 people from all over the world coming to talk just about family planning with a lot of population health, environment conversations. We had press conferences on contraceptive technology. There were a lot of African and Middle Eastern and Asian journalists there, but there were representatives from Time Magazine, New York Times, CNN, some public radio stations and others. And I didn't see any of them cover any of the 13 PHE sessions. I did read excellent articles in Security Beat, so clearly their niche communications works. And we had things on contraceptive technology, and given there's huge advances and a lot of action going on in contraceptive technology right now, and you would think the U.S. would be interested just given the war that is being declared on Planned Parenthood and the reduced access to family planning and safe abortion that you have in the United States. So nobody really cares about those kinds of issues. So how do you communicate this stuff unless I go out and pick a fight, and then somebody will cover it, and then I get fired? So, I have a kind of another story from Madagascar. I went on a Sierra Club study tour one time, and so they could see some population health environment programs funded by USAID. And we went to a very remote mountaintop village, and the village elder entertained us over a meal and was talking to us about the fact that they liked this program because it taught them that leaving your fields fallow for a year and your wives fallow for a year gave you healthier plants and healthier children and mothers, and everybody did better, and that they were learning fishing and all that. And he said, we don't know when the rains are coming anymore, so we don't know when to farm, we don't know what's going on with the climate. And we thought, maybe if Congress went outside and gardened, they'd realize, yes, there is climate change. So I understand how you bring these personal stories home, but I can't do that with the Congress that thinks I'm only dealing with either icky issues or unproven science. And we have another issue at USAID in that I work in a technical office, which means we're really nerdy, and nobody really wants the level of detail we can provide. And we do excellent programs. They last 5 years. And then we do analysis on what worked, what didn't work, and sitting down 6 years after a program started and sitting with you and saying, here's how we know where we went wrong. There's not really a headline there. There's absolutely no twerking. And so how do we communicate this to people and get people to understand exactly how their tax dollars are being spent, and to get kind of the sneers that appear on some of the faces of Congress, which, because they give us our appropriations, are an audience of ours to communicate with. So I remain a bit skeptical. I'm not sure Congress or Rush Limbaugh follow tweets around my issues, or if they do, it's only to develop things to talk against us on. And so how do we reach a bigger audience? And I agree with my colleagues, there is much less interest, I think, amongst the American public in reading about science. And when you were talking about Kennedy, I was thinking that was kind of the dawn of a huge scientific advances in the United States, and people were so behind it, and we were the leader and all this. And I don't know if you could say the word science now and have people get kind of terribly excited. So I'm really more interested in hearing from you than having you hear from skeptical me.
Thank you, Sandra.
Can I just say I don't want to hear the words Congress and twerking in the same paragraph.
Well, you got to say Viagra.
That was work. Really hard work.
Oh, that's great. The issue of how do you communicate or get attention without picking a fight is one that I'm quite interested in hearing. I hope some people in the audience might have some suggestions. Before we turn to Q&A, though, I do have one question for the panel, and it builds off what Sandra just ended with. We hear a lot these days about a growing scientific illiteracy among the public. And do you think this is true? Do you think that the public is less literate about science? And if so, how does that affect your job in trying to talk to policymakers? And where do you see, are there opportunities to build literacy in your field?
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say that one of the differences between the day you described when we lost the president and today is that back then there were 3 television networks and a limited source of news. What all communicators are dealing with right now is an increasingly fragmented news information marketplace, and I think one that's far from settling down. I think we'd probably all up here agree on that. And when I mentioned before, I used a term I like to use called the interested public, because there's no public. Not in the sense that there was when everybody was either watching NBC or CBS or ABC and got basically the same news. People now go out and find their own sources of news. So increasingly thinking about the audience that you want to reach, what you want to tell them, and what you want them to do with that information when they get it is essential to communication strategy, because you're not going to reach part of your strategy may be reaching the quote-unquote larger audience, but you have to know who they are and what you want them to do with the information that you give them. It's what my old boss on the Hill used to say, is putting the hay down where the goats can get it. And that's increasingly what communicators need to do. So anytime, like right now, we've got a program that I'm working with at Pew where we really want to establish a pathway to approve experimental or new antibiotics for very limited populations, people who have no other options. And we have to dance around the whole superbug, but everybody knows there are drug-resistant bacteria out there that are becoming ever more a threat, and there are some folks out there now who are coming down with infections there are no treatments for. So we're trying to look for a pathway to bring some of those to the market and into the hands of doctors more quickly. I can't get that message to a general public and expect that what I'm looking for is going to happen. I have to target the policy audiences that can make that happen, the people on the Hill, the people in the regulatory agencies, folks who can actually influence policy, and of course people in the healthcare industry and the drug manufacturers. So identifying the audiences you need to reach, understanding the level of information they need, where they stand on it, and then laying out your campaign to put the hay down where the goats can get it is really the only kind of communication strategy that I find works anymore, especially in very wonky, very scientific areas of endeavor.
Yeah, that's very well put, Laurie. And I think one of the issues now is there's hay everywhere. Goats are, choking on hay. But, most of it is bad for them. It's not nutritious. And I mean, I think from a communication standpoint, we live in a free-for-all right now. People are constantly getting information, but how much of it is good? The second piece, it's a big cultural shift, is this. When I was a little guy, Science was part of our everyday world. Everybody I knew how to make a crystal radio out of stuff that was in the house. Everybody I knew could tear down a lawnmower engine and put it back together again. My first radio, I took a transistor radio apart, ran some wires out, and stuck it into a speaker I'd salvaged from an old Buick or something. We knew how to take stuff apart and put it back together again because it was a part of our world. Cars broke down incessantly. You needed tools in the trunk to to get your date home at night. But now, if my car breaks down, it's a computer panel. It's $1,200 that needs to be replaced. I don't know how to do that. If my microwave breaks, what do I do about that? We're not connected with the scientific pieces of our lives anymore in the way we used to be. And so part of the challenge is, how do we make science relevant and interesting to people who are becoming increasingly illiterate when it comes to just the things in our world that we all depend on every day? So I do think that's one of our big challenges as communicators.
I feel like I have some pressure to make a metaphor out of hay. I don't know if making making hay while the sun shines or needle in a haystack strategy. I don't know. I guess I'm going to be a little bit contrary and say, I think in PAI's work, there is always, making the scientific case. Like the research has to be the foundation of the advocacy. Like, we cannot move away from that. But I would almost say, 40% of that work is that piece. 60%, I feel like, is more building political will. Because we are not trying to reach the general public. Most of the times we are working with policymakers or we're working with advocates so that they can reach their policymakers. So those folks usually are educated about the science and believe the science. I think the question is, how do we understand the motivations of the policymakers enough so that we are providing them with the political cover they need when we ask them to take the actions that we want, right? Sometimes we are talking to policymakers on timelines that when we think about it, because we care about a better world, we care about women, we're like, and 20 years from now, this woman will have a mansion. I'm just, but for a policymaker whose timeline is much shorter, sometimes even the beautiful world we're creating for them, sometimes we need to remember to ground ourselves in the realities of the competing priorities that they have, the timelines that they have. And I think, to me, that's where the biggest challenge is. And I think, working in coalition and does help with that, and trying to think of new and creative ways to provide political will and build champions obviously is critical. And then in terms of the haymaking, I would say, on the positive side, because of this fragmentation of media, we have an incredible opportunity now to produce content and reach audiences in a way that we never would have before, right? A small group like PAI, reaching out directly to the New York Times, for example, a few years ago when we were just building this case for family planning and the links between that and climate change adaptation, it's a heavy lift, but we produced this interactive map that layered on all these connections between population growth, climate change vulnerability, unmet need for family planning. And because that was so visually compelling, then Andy Revkin was like, this is the coolest thing ever, can I talk to you about this? So just to be a little bit, maybe I'm the millennial on the panel, but just saying that there is also an incredible opportunity for us to think in new and creative ways to reach our audiences.
I think for us, for our work, as I said, we deal less with the science rather than with the information flow and the overload of wrong information, pure wrong, or information that is just not in the right context. So I think we spend a lot of time debunking messages, and one of the ways that I feel it's what's proven good for our work is to just take some of the main myths, write them down, and debunk them in a piece of paper, and just call it the myths and facts of what's really going on, and then sharing this information. I mean, you've been talking a lot about Congress. For our work, we've just seen that we're not dealing with a Congress, not a functioning Congress. We're dealing with more going into the states, dealing with state policymakers, dealing with rural communities, farmers, other advocates that work on that kind of level to move things forward and kind of pushing. We're not, I mean, we're a German organization, so we're not allowed to lobby, and plus nobody would pay attention to a German organization. We don't pay any taxes, so it's our lobbying efforts are limited. We're not allowed, but we want to spread the message so that the people here can put it into a better perspective with the overflow of information that is out there. So I think that's where we kind of try to tap into that area.
I don't have a lot to add to all this, except to say that I can't get my goats to Madagascar, and unless there's five-star hotels and shopping, so we rely on PAI and Sierra Club and such to find the five-star shopping and hotels. So the goats will go to the developing world and see our programs in action, and they've done a really good job with it. We can't do that as a U.S. government agency, also, I work with very skeptical goats. They don't really want to know. There's a lot of them out there, even though you do get facts and figures to them. They just figure that's our opinion. So it can be difficult, and I do kind of view our audience as less the American public, although we do try to reach them. I think there's a lot of sense that public relations coming out of a government agency is just that, and not reality and not the facts and all these kinds of things. And we're not supposed to lobby because we're a U.S. government agency and such, so I can't ask for more money to do really great films and things like that. So we're kind of at the mercy of the constituencies and the coalition building, which we do a lot of with PAI, with Sierra Club, with a lot of other kinds of Planned Parenthood and others. So we kind of rely on others to help us get our word out. And like I said, we're very technical, so we can get you in a really good, long, intense scientific discussion, but you will never get away from them. So.
Well, thank you. Now I'd like to open it up to questions. There are some of my colleagues will have a microphone. Please wait for the microphone and then give your name and your affiliation. I will start down here.
Hi, I'm Mona Sarfati, family physician, public health physician from George Mason University from the Center for Climate Change Communication. Science is definitely, I think, like has been said here by the panel, more difficult to explain and more difficult for people to hear in the current time. But health is not. Health is really of great interest to the public. And some work has been done by the center that I'm a part of, the Center for Climate Change Communication, showing that when you talk to people about their health and point out ways that improving health can coincide with things that also have the potential to improve the climate, that plays very well, that across the spectrum of public opinion on climate change, that all the groups can hear that. So our center has segmented the population into the alarmed, the concerned, the cautious, the disengaged, the doubtful, and the dismissive. And that's climate change in the American mind. Some of you may have heard of it. George Mason did this with Yale University, and they've repeated it every year with a sample of the population that approximates the U.S. population, and shown how these groups are changing over time, and also give some of the nuances of their thinking. So in trying some health messaging, all of the groups responded somewhat more favorably to messages about climate change than they would otherwise. And so there are a number of very specific areas, health conditions, that are easy to talk about in the same few sentences with climate. And one of them is asthma, because as the climate heats up, the ozone increases, and when air is stagnant, the particulate matter, which is generated by diesel engines and by cars idling and by nitrous oxides that come from cars, tend also to accumulate. And so the quality of the air deteriorates, and this means that we have a lot more population, children and adults, who are subject to asthma. And in many cities right now, it's 20% of the school children who have asthma. That's a big increase over what it was 20 years ago. And nobody is able to explain exactly why, but it has been modeled by an MIT group. I mean, there's really good evidence that this is based on the quality. There's good evidence that this is on the quality of the air. That is really one of the major factors at work in this tremendous rise in asthma that we're seeing, which is a $50 billion a year condition in the United States. Another, is Lyme disease. And dengue fever, I'll mention that. I don't know if you all are all aware, but every county in Florida now has serological evidence that there has been dengue fever infection. Maybe not full-blown dengue fever presenting, but infection with dengue fever, which shows up in the serological studies. And in Loudoun County, right near here, there is a tremendously widespread, in fact, endemic Lyme disease, and only about a third of the people who have some evidence that they've been infected with Lyme even have a memory of having been outside. So there is tremendous opportunity there, and I just, wanted to hear what the panels thought about that. Panel
Thank
members.
you. Yes, I've heard, there is some, recently at the Environmental Journalists Conference, Steve Curwood was saying that, might be able to get more environmental stories on the air if you connect them to local health issues. I don't know if Lori, if that's something that
No, I
you
think
know.
that's obviously what we all look for is, and it's been mentioned on the panel before, is what is the human impact of what's going on in science and in challenges to health. And I think that's telling the human story is a tried and true way to do that. And everybody is worried about their health, and they're worried about the health of their children as well, which is something that is very effective in communications. The other thing that I'd like to hear some of the folks talk about is the increase in the accessibility of graphics and animations and data. It used to really be difficult to get that across. Now, for example, if you're talking about climate change, I just saw an incredible time lapse of what's been happening to one of the glaciers from space. And the fact that this kind of information can be brought down to everybody's computer, and that it's so much more accessible and affordable than it used to be. And I'd love to hear some stories from the panel about how they've been able to use that to make their points, because that's something that obviously NASA does a lot of that, but I'd like to hear some of the ways that you guys have done that.
Well, I know, Dilly, you have some examples.
Yeah, I can start. So I mentioned that, PAI has a map that illustrates the relationships between population and climate change. And so it does exactly that. So it just layers in data to create what we call climate change hotspots. So you see a map of the world, and then by just layering variable over variable, you start to see which parts of the world are hotspots. And for us, a hotspot is an area with, low resilience to climate change, declining agricultural production, high population growth. And then, another layer would be, we also look at, do women in those areas have access to the family planning services that they need and want? So when you overlay all of that, you present a really clear picture for people about the fact that these things are connected. I can tell you 2,000 words about this relationship, but when you just see it on a map, it just brings it home. So that's just one way we've done it.
And the other thing that I've seen with these visualizations is that they transcend culture, they transcend language, and they're incredibly useful on social media as well. The pickup on social media of images, if you've got a picture or an image or an interactive that doesn't take up too much bandwidth, you can get incredible pickup on your social than you might not otherwise. And really, everybody's chasing the viral video. It's become an overused word. But again, if you want your audience to discover something, these visualizations are incredibly powerful.
Any more questions in the audience? Right back here.
Good afternoon. I'm Jerry Miller. I'm president of Science for Decisions, and prior to that I was assistant director for ocean sciences at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And in that role, I dealt with aspects of several different kinds of urgent situations, environmental emergencies of various sorts, ranging from the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico to climate change. And I regard climate change as an emergency. And I would like to get the panel's thoughts on how to communicate emergencies that play out over long time scales. The BP oil spill was very obvious. It's happening now. It's serious. Lots of people are affected by it. But climate change is something that the public regards, and I think our politicians regard, as being decades down the road. So how do we lend the sense of urgency that Bob advised us to think about to slowly unfolding emergencies?
Bob, do you want to?
Yeah, Mr. Miller, I appreciate that. I think, in some sense, slowly unfolding emergency is a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? And I mean, our government responds to crises, but a slowly unfolding issue, whether it's the social security, the long-term debt crisis, the infrastructure crisis, any of a number we could name, it's very difficult to get political attention to it. And I think part of the challenge with climate is that in addition to that sort of natural inertial problem, you have this, the wealthiest industry in the history of the world spending more than $100 million every year just in Washington lobbying against this, spending huge amounts of advertising dollars trying to confuse and obfuscate and even mislead people on this. And as you know from your experience here in Washington, all you have to do is sow enough doubt to prevent change, and you have succeeded, whereas we must instill enough confidence to enact change. And so it's a different dynamic. But what you say is absolutely true. We do face an emergency. We faced an emergency in the Gulf of Mexico when people could watch 180 million gallons of toxic crude blasting out of that hole for 3 months before it was temporarily sealed and 5 before it was permanently sealed. And yet, at the end of the day, Congress did absolutely nothing to strengthen the safeguards that we need to make that industry more, less risky. And so, boy, that's just a difficult dynamic that we continue to deal with and push back against. But I will say the optimism is that when I go talk to crowds of people who are younger than I am, under the age of 35, let's say, they understand this. They get it. There is a natural demographic unfolding now that is putting certain groups of people on the wrong side of history when they persist in saying that this is not an emergency, it's something that we don't have to deal with. They're finding themselves on the wrong side of history. We need to keep driving that message home. And the final thing, if I could just close the loop on the last question, I think the one really wonderful thing about the kinds of graphics Dilly's talking about is that, ultimately what I say doesn't matter. What matters is what you hear, what you understand, what you believe, and what you will remember. And when people see a map, we tend to believe that. We tend to understand it. We tend to remember it. And so these kinds of graphics, increasingly, we at the NRDC are not where we need to be on it, but we've begun hiring people who are specialists in this, young people I might add, who understand this a lot better than I do, and so I find that very encouraging.
I'm a little worried about what I like to call short attention span theater here. I'm extremely old, and I remember when back in the 70s we were able to pass clean water, clean air legislation because people looked around and they saw the reality of what was happening to their rivers and their streams and their air. People can look around today and see what's happening as a result of climate change and some of the other things that are going on, drug-resistant bacteria, but the sense of urgency and the sense of joint action is missing, and I honestly don't know why that is. I don't know if it's because our sources of information are too fragmented. I don't know if it's because people have short attention spans or there's just too many people on the planet anymore are we reaching some sort of critical, but I don't know why we were able to summon the political will to get something done on a pressing environmental issue. How many years ago is that now? It's a really long time ago, and we can't seem to do it now. And if anybody's got any advice for me on that, I'd welcome it, because it was doable once, and it doesn't seem as doable now. And I'm glad to hear you say that maybe it's the next generation coming along that thinks they're getting the fuzzy end of the lollipop and they need to figure this out. And I hope that's true, because I'm a little less optimistic. We just worked on a bill in Congress. It actually passed. A standalone bill passed. I know you're shocked, but and it was to regulate, to track drugs through the drug supply chain and to regulate compounding pharmacies. We couldn't get that passed until 60-some people were injected with fungal meningitis in their spines and died, and 700 more got sick and had their lives ruined by it. So what I'm afraid is that we have to wait for really, really large-scale tragedies to do anything, and that they have to be close to home. They can't be in the Philippines. We may know that the Philippines created it, but there's a lot more angst about oil bubbling up in the Gulf than I even feel right now for the disaster in the Philippines. I'm sorry, that was kind of a downer.
Down here, Michael. Michael. I think it's a challenge that everyone faces up here is the sort of the unseen emergencies that happen because of the time scales. So I'm glad that came up. Michael?
This is a follow-up to your question to the panel. What sort of education would you recommend to someone who is interested in the communication field on these issues? What sort of things would you study? What sort of experiences would you go for in order to be prepared for? And I'm guessing from your standpoint, being aware of some of these new graphic technologies would be part of that, or visualization technologies.
Absolutely. I'm looking for graphic designers right now. I'm looking for web developers. I'm looking, in addition to people who can put a sentence together, which is becoming ever more rare. I don't know why people can't write anymore, but they can't. And also people who have the ability to really encapsulate difficult concepts in ways that can reach a target audience. But yeah, the visual aspect and the digital aspect of communication is so much more important now than it was when I started out during the Jurassic.
I think that's I'm sorry, I think that's a really key thing, but we have technology at USAID that we've just discovered pictographs. And so this makes this kind of communication a bit more difficult. So we do have to rely on words more, and words that are spelled correctly and with verbs that agree. And that is proving to be a little harder. And trying to reach out to all these niche markets and communications elements and try to get some kind of compelling message to them and drive them to PAI's website so they can look at something besides our pictographs. So I agree with all that. Sorry, Dilly.
I was just going to piggyback off that, but say that, storytelling first, I think, is the skill. And because you have to have a good story, not everything lends itself to be visualized. So if you have someone who can find the good story and who can convey the need and the so what, regardless of in the medium first, I think that is the biggest skill. If you can find those people, that's the best people to have on your team. And then once you have that good story, then it's obviously in this environment, the skills to push it out on social media, to visualize it. And sometimes the visualization doesn't even have to be with data. It could be a compelling photograph with that quote that person got from that, woman or that man. That can be the powerful visualization. But I think if you can get good storytellers, then it's easier to translate the story into visual media.
Can I add one funny story? A couple of months ago, the transatlantic energy and climate community was very stunned when Fox News morning show showed that, in fact, Germany was investing in so much solar energy because they had so much more sun than the United States. And they showed a map. So I just want to urge people to kind of use the right kind of map and keep that in mind, to keep that it's correct information when using visualizations and graphics like that.
We've all suspected for some time that the sun plays favorites.
Let me tell you, the sun does never shine in Turkey.
I would just add really quickly, I've had the pleasure of being on Fox to talk about climate any number of times, and it's always an edifying experience. I think that one thing that hadn't changed, I can remember, 20 years ago in newspapers, I spent 30 years as a newspaper reporter, and I can remember when every major paper in the country, including the Atlanta Constitution where I worked, but even smaller papers like Richmond and Charleston, other papers where I was, they had a science desk. It was usually a science and medicine desk. It was a proud piece of turf, and it was someplace that normal mortal reporters like myself were not allowed to get near, because, as was often explained to me when I would try to report on something, that's not how science happens. Now, that may have been a little bit too elitist, but these science reporters had something in common that we all need to have today, which goes to the education question Mike raised. One, a common language. They understood a language of science. Two were basic scientific principles that don't change, that our knowledge of them evolve, but the basic principles. And three, application. How is this applied so that when someone goes down to the Gulf of Mexico, they can understand enough about the geologic background there that they can connect the dots between this natural wonderland that has been created, this nursery for the Gulf of Mexico in the Louisiana wetlands, and the same geologic history that put all that oil and gas down there, and how do we reconcile that? So just as one example. So I think learning the language, learning the principles, and learning the application is essential here.
This is a question near and dear to my heart for two reasons. One, we have, I think, a really strong internship program here with our program, in which is very writing heavy. They're cheering in the back. Thank you. And I think that's, practice, especially when it comes to writing and with guidance, with good expert guidance. And unfortunately, I'm not so sure how much of that many of today's interns get to do. So I would think more programs that are writing heavy would help. And then also as a member of the Society of Environmental Journalists, which offers a mentorship program that is also a good way for students to hook up with veterans who have been doing this for a long time and to learn the language, as Bob mentioned. More questions? In the middle, right here.
Naomi Brodke with the Sierra Club. It's really great to hear my colleagues on the panel, so thank you for shout-outs to Sierra Club. In response to short attention spans, I might offer one thought, which is that there's a lot of exhaustion, emergency exhaustion. So I think that it's not just that we have short attention spans, or that it's in the Philippines or elsewhere in the world. Hurricane Sandy was a year ago, and it hit the entire East Coast. Some of us in this room didn't have power for a week. Colorado was just a few months ago in the fires. So I think that a lot of people are getting exhausted by it. I have a question, which is kind of two-part. I was in Arkansas a week ago giving presentations in Fayetteville, and one was to a room full of people who are very familiar with this subject. A lot of them were Sierra Club members. And then the next day was to a group of young people at the university. And the older folks in the room were very familiar with this, like I said, and one woman was frustrated. She's been working for 47 years on the intersections of population, health, and environment. She was tired of hearing the same response. And so I wonder if you could expand a little bit on how do we communicate to not the skeptics necessarily, because there are certainly a lot of those, but also the older folks who are tired of hearing the same messaging. And then to that same group who are skeptics, how do we also communicate with the older folks who don't really want to hear about it because maybe they don't care, or it doesn't affect their lives as much, or maybe it does affect their lives, but I don't know, they just don't want to hear it. If you could expand a little bit on how to reach different audiences. And
Can I turn that back on you and ask you, what do you want those old folks to do with that information?
That's part of it. This woman who's been working on it for 47 years said, I've been working on this for 47 years and I'm tired of hearing people tell me to take shorter showers. I'm honestly getting offended. I was like,
So what to do about message fatigue?
Just an idea. I don't work on this specifically, but you need to create, for change to happen, you need to create ways for people to see that they can change and create new infrastructure. But that's for policymakers, but you need to create some kind of base asking for change, so that they can change their behavior. I think that's key to it, and getting, trying to frame it in a more positive, what can I do to, rather than this is what's going to happen, and focus on the emergencies and what disasters that are happening, but what can I do to help that these disasters won't happen as frequently anymore. So I think changing our infrastructure, enabling people to see what, the shower example is a silly one, but it touches upon something that is at the heart of the issue. You need to create a way or a structure for people to change their behavior, essentially.
I work with audiences a lot that are not particularly on my side, and so a lot of what I do is try to hear what they want to hear, and then figure out how you give the message in a way that they can hear it. And so sometimes it's just sitting down with someone like that, or getting several people that have been working in the field, working in this issue for 45 years, and kind of hear what they don't believe about what you're saying. And that has actually worked in good stead. I was at USAID under the Bush administration when there was not so much support for family planning, and just being able to sit down and talk with Bush officials and say, we say family planning saves lives, and say, well, no, that's ridiculous, it doesn't. So then you start a conversation. Why do you think this? So you can start figuring your message out so it's something that they can hear. And so it may not be take shorter showers. It's like, spend less time in the shower sort of thing. So it's just hearing exactly where the prickly point is and trying to message around that.
Anybody else? Or a question over here?
Hi, Richard Beazle, California Polytechnic State University, and I'm here with the Environmental Communication Division of the National Communication Association. So thank you to all the panelists for coming out, and thank you to the people who are putting this together. The question I had was, so we heard a lot of different kinds of strategies and tactics and techniques, so maybe put a face to what's going on, maybe it's something about visuals, maybe it's this or that. My question is about what kind of, well, I guess I have two parts. The first one, what kind of process do you have, or what processes have you tried to choose the particular strategy? How did you decide it was that one that you wanted to do, or that's the one that you want to go for at this time? And then the second part to that is, did you ever have an oops moment where you thought you had it and then you implemented it and then said, oh, wait a minute, that's not working the way we want it to? So what's the process you go through to get to the strategy choice? And then did you have that oops moment? And it could be something as simple as we just have done it for a while and it's trial and error, and we remember we tried this once and we don't want to do it again. Or it could be, did you do focus groups, or did you do, what's the process, and then what's the oops moment?
The way I do it is I work backward from the result I want. What do I want the policy outcome to be? What do I want the result to be? I think sometimes we just say, oh, if only people knew about this, they'd care as much as I do. And that's an oops moment, because it turns out they don't unless you give them a reason to care and figure out what that reason is and get the hay down where they can get it. So when I'm putting together a strategy, I work backward from the result I want. And I say, okay, the result is a bill about compounding pharmacies on Capitol Hill. Who do I need to reach to make that happen? What information do I need to reach them with? If I get attacked, or if the pharma is against me, how do I respond? How do I counter that? So try to game it out from the beginning, and also do, whenever you can, and sometimes resources aren't here, test your message. Focus groups, polling. I won't go into the name of the member of the Congress or even the issue at this moment, but we thought perhaps an ad reminding a member of Congress about something awful that had happened in his district would perhaps persuade him to take action on something. And we did some polling and found out they loved that he wasn't taking action on that. So, don't assume that everyone's heart is in the same place yours is, and don't assume that your message will resonate just because you know the true shining truth of it. It's a complicated world out there, and the way that people think about things has changed. So on the Hill, I did several campaigns as well as being a communicator on the Hill, and we didn't do a thing. We didn't put an ad on the air. We didn't spend $1 unless we knew a persuadable voter was out there. So you figure out who are the people you need to convince to get your policy objective done. You figure out what they listen to. You know, if you're doing a health care bill, it may be more important to get in the Nursing Association's newsletter than in the New York Times. It's that kind of targeting of your audience. You find your interested public, you give them something to do. When you said people are tired of hearing the same advice, what they want is to do something. They want to accomplish something. So you figure out, what can we do? So that person who's been working on it for 40 years is going to sit back and say, damn, I did good work today. I accomplished something I wanted. And it's hard. It's really hard because we're getting, as we've discussed here, we're getting less done than we used to all the time. But that's how I do it. I start out with what I want to have happen and then try and back up and figure out the strategies that'll get me there.
Yeah, I would only echo it, and you know, we sum it up. We say, what's the objective, what's the audience, and what's the message, and it's the same kind of thing. And our oops moments are every time we forget to go through that process, because we get there by hook or crook, but it can be painful. And the message is always, you know, what's the problem, what's the solution, and what's the ask, because people do want to be told, okay, now you've got my attention, what can I do about it? And if we don't have an ask, if we don't have a directive, if we don't have a solution, we've created a market for a product that doesn't exist.
I have a great oops moment. So when I was at the at HHS, the Medicare agency was going to go around and do events where they would talk to people about changes in Medicare policy, and they were, you know, get their reactions and stuff like this. And I was looking at the schedule they'd laid out for these meetings, and I said, no, you are not going to have a listening session at Gallaudet University. No. So that's another oops, is that sometimes you are so wound up in what you want to accomplish that you can't see a great big mistake sitting right in front of you. So the only other thing I would advise is go talk to someone who has nothing to do with what you're doing and say, does this make sense? They will sometimes look at you and say, are you out of your mind? So that's the other thing you do, is go to the non-interested public and see how that's going to land on them.
Never hurts to have that second or third or fourth set of eyes, right? One last question before the break. How about in the back right there, Dale?
Hi, I'm Dale Willman. I'm a journalist and a proud member of the Society of Environmental Journalists, so thank you for talking about them. I feel in a dubious position that I need to defend the American public to some extent. This whole idea of short attention forms in the U.S., not just the sentient beings, but all life forms in the U.S. listen to public radio. Atlantic magazine is doing better than it has. There is an outlet for long-form information if it's written well and it's compelling. But I want to pick up on what you were talking about, Lori, about the environmental legislation in the 70s. How did that happen? And this comes from my perspective as a journalist for a long time, but I think an argument can be made that it's not that policymakers grow a spine and actually do what's right. That what happens frequently is that when you look at the history of the modern environmental movement, 1960s, it was Rachel Carson and Silent Spring that began to create this consciousness. But then in 1969, you had the spill off Santa Barbara, and you had the burning of the Cuyahoga River 45 minutes from where I was growing up. In 1970, you had an event that the organizers expected 10,000 people to show up, and you had tens of millions at Earth Day. Suddenly, Congress said, wow, we need to do something about the environment. Then when you look at CERCLA, Superfund legislation, what led to that? It was Valley of the Drums, it was Love Canal. It was the immense public outrage around that that came from extended media coverage of those issues. Bhopal led to Community Right to Know Act. So it's the emphasis on focusing on policymakers and trying to affect incremental change as versus trying to inform and educate the public in ways that lead to a level of outrage, if that's needed, to affect change. And I'm curious
But
if
when
you
do you
think
think
that's
the
an element of
last
it.
time is something like that happened? Because there have been outrages since Bhopal, and you know.
Right, and I'm trying to get my head around that, whether
Yeah.
it's the BP spill or some other things. But I'd be curious what level of coverage and extended coverage happened, because there were things after the BP spill that sort of distracted, and I don't recall what they were right now, but that sort of took over the.
Yeah, but you would have thought that would have more staying power than it did, and you're right.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of a couple of things, Dale, in response. One is that, you know, when the National Environmental Policies Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, all these foundational pieces of legislation that form the edifice of our environmental protections today were all passed around that era you described, 69, 70, 71, 72, and signed into law by Richard Nixon. They were passed with overwhelming majorities in both houses of Congress. Nixon vetoed the Clean Water Act because he said it was too expensive, and that veto was overridden. But I'm glad you raised it because it makes the point. There was this overwhelming veto-proof majority in both houses on both sides of the aisle. We had a consensus around this. I think we can't, maybe it's because I saw Miss Saigon last night at my daughter's high school, but we can't also forget that both parties were in a terrible situation around the Vietnam War, in the sense of let's try to get something done, and here was something that Nixon and the Democrats could agree on and get done. But in any event, what has happened since then is one party has made even the word environmentalism a toxic, ideologically driven term that is just very unfortunate. And so we have to somehow rebuild the bipartisan majority for environmental protections to make the kind of progress that we saw 40 years ago.
I'd like to ask Sandra or Dilly to talk a little bit about how do you try to get the public interested in an issue that is mainly taking place in far away, when you're talking about family planning or women and maternal health in the developing world, and how do you make connections to the U.S. situation?
I mean, I can start. I mean, I think ultimately it's by showing the parallels between the life of the woman in Malawi and the life of the woman in Massachusetts, right? I mean, I think the good thing for those who are interested in both family planning and environmental issues is that, I mean, there are unprecedented attacks on women's reproductive rights happening right now in the US. And so at least trying to paint that initial picture of access for a woman, I don't think people have to think that far right now, because they're seeing what's happening in Texas, for example. And then once they can get that picture in their head about what it's like to not want to become pregnant, but you cannot, that choice is taken away from you, and then you make the connections then to, health issues, just general well-being, and the environment. I think that's what makes it click for people, just drawing those parallels.
We try a lot to show what impact the work in the developing world can have on the U.S. and how it can slow immigration, it can reduce the security dividend, which PAI has done a lot of research on, and those kinds of issues. And just, of course, that's kind of wonky terms, so the public kind of goes, oh, yeah. But we do try to show how the work we're doing overseas does make an impact on the U.S. And I get a lot of questions like, why are you spending all this money on those people when we have so much need here? And I just remind them that it's 0.01% of 1% of the U.S. international budget that includes the Pentagon, and that comes to, for each of you, a latte, so you can afford it.
Thank you. Well, speaking of coffee, it's time for the coffee break. It will be about 15 minutes to have coffee and cookies. Please consume your coffee outside before you come back in, and then we'll reconvene here at 2:45 for the second panel on climate change, skepticism, and denial. Thank you very much. And please thank our panelists.
Nice talking.
Great job. Well done.
We have a new, relatively new, I shouldn't say she's
today, which is on climate change skepticism and denial. I want to thank Megan Parker and the Environmental Security and Change Program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this. We, as Megan indicated earlier, have been talking about this for almost a year. And it's nice to see it come to fruition. Would also like to thank Richard Beazle with the Environmental Communication Division of the National Communication Association, who was receptive to the idea and helped us put together the proposal. Also Ross Singer, who was, I think, navigating people down here. And then I don't know that she's here, but Michelle Randall with the Washington, D.C. office of the National Communication Association was extremely helpful in dealing with our many emendations of the program entry. So I appreciate her patience and assistance. I'm going to let you consult the biographies that are provided by the Wilson Center on the handout for the detailed information about each of our panelists. But we are going to be looking at some articles from a special issue of American Behavioral Scientist that was edited by Riley Dunlap. He's going to talk about the series, the special series overall, or special issue overall. Then he'll talk about one article in particular. Peter Jacques, who was also in that volume, will talk about another. I will then try to serve as a segue between those two presentations and then our responses from Mayana Layson, who is participating via a narrated PowerPoint presentation. She's currently in Chicago. And then Rebecca Bertram will follow up, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So our first speaker is Riley Dunlap, who is the Regents Professor and Lawrence L. and Georgia Ena Dresser Professor at Oklahoma State University.
So Mayana will be talking.
Yeah.
You know, so I won't be able, I guess I have to stand here and look at this. Okay. Well, as Michael mentioned, this stems from, I didn't know how this was going to go, a 2010 AAAS session on climate change skepticism and denial. And it took some doing, a long delay. We lost some people, literally. Sadly, the late Stephen Schneider, who had been the star of our session, passed away before he could write his paper and so forth. And it took quite a while to get it out, and partly I was too busy. But this came out last June, just recently, and it should be available in most libraries. Here are the contents, and this is kind of, I'm afraid, can you read this at all? Okay, so I had a short introduction, and I just want to, try to give a sense of the fact that social scientists in particular, but along with a number of journalists, are really beginning to do a lot of empirical work on climate change skepticism and denial. Skepticism being more the broad public layperson's views, and then organized denial, looking at the key actors. And then in there, Peter and I have a chapter, it's HACCUS, on climate change denial books, conservative think tanks. Mayana looks at some conflict within climate science in the early days, the modelers versus other people. A graduate student and I look at conservative columnists. I'll be talking about that shortly. And then 3 other papers by Freudenberg and Muselli, and sadly Bill Freudenberg passed away shortly after finishing his essay, Max Boykoff, and then Lasirowetz et al. So let me, since the first 3 papers are going to be covered, I want to quickly shift to the 3 who do not have representatives here today. So in their paper, Freudenberg and Muselli, you can see the title, they provide an analysis that I thought is very unique. There's always criticism of the IPCC from the denial community, the skeptics saying, oh, you exaggerate, you're alarmist. So what they do is take projections from IPCC reports, and then they take what they call science stories, the kind of thing that an Andy Revkin might write on climate science, coming out about the same time, and they compare them. And of course, because of the peer review and the delay, what they find is, in fact, IPCC reports tend to understate the seriousness of problems if you use the latest science. And in the process, they obviously argue charges of alarmism are erroneous, and they attribute this overly cautious approach within climate science to the constant pressure from the denial community, all the accusations. It's like people are bending over backwards. And you might recall, some of you, that Bryce Oreskes and some others had an article with a very different technique fairly recently coming to similar conclusions. Max Boykoff, who's probably done more than anyone else on climate change in the media, has kind of an overview piece here, and his emphasis is to look at the characteristics of the news media that enable outlier voices, as he calls them, kind of a combination skeptics, contrarian scientists, and hardcore denialists, to receive vastly disproportionate attention by the media and therefore have excessive influence in public discussions. He pays a lot of attention to the techniques used by these outlier voices to put pressure on the media to give them access. And again, he clearly rebuts the claims that we hear a lot that the outliers aren't given a chance. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests that compared to other countries, outlier voices get far more attention in US media than in other media. They are hardly suppressed. And finally, an interesting piece, Lasirowitz et al. Do one of the first and so far only really solid empirical piece looking at the potential effects of the ClimateGate controversy. So they did a survey in late 2008 and then another in early 2010. And you might remember ClimateGate exploded in November of 2009, just before the Copenhagen COP. What they found was, yes, it had a discernible impact, but basically only about 12% of Americans were really affected, and these tended to be overwhelmingly conservatives, Republicans who were already quite skeptical. And they end up arguing, because you might also recall there was quite a noticeable decline in many polls in public opinion or public concern about climate change. And they argue that to attribute it all to ClimateGate is very difficult because, of course, it was something called the economic crash. There was some very strange things in the weather, Snowmageddon and so forth. And I think it's an urban myth that ClimateGate has had this profound impact, especially leading to distrust of scientists. And I've seen a recent piece just reviewed looking at Google searches and so forth that suggests that ClimateGate was a pretty short-term effect. It certainly gave the denial community a tool, and they continue to use it, but its actual effect, I'm not sure. Okay, let me turn quickly to this paper that Sean Elsasser, a graduate student, and this actually was the basis of his thesis, and I did. There's a lot of work nowadays looking at the role of the conservative media, especially Fox, the Murdoch papers, right-wing talk radio, and arguing that they constitute a critical component of what people call the denial machine, conservative think tanks, foundations, astroturf groups, etc. And a number of studies are focusing on key elements of the conservative, what some people call conservative echo chamber, and they document how consistently anti-climate science and dismissive of climate change are Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, at least editorials, one study of Rush Limbaugh's show, etc. But one thing that had escaped attention up till now was the role of syndicated conservative columnists. And we think that was a very important omission because people like George Will, Cal Thomas, so many others, they actually reach a very broad audience, not that conservative segment that Fox especially targets. So we set out to study how they deal with climate change. So what we did, and you can see the lag time here, but we analyzed conservative columnists' writing on climate change from 2007 to 2010. 4 very interesting years, because the last 2 years of the Bush administration, when they didn't have to worry about action being taken, in the first 2 years of the Obama, when it's sort of climate change denial went on steroids, so to speak, because they were fearful that Obama and the Democrats might do something. So we wanted to examine how conservative columnists discuss climate change, climate science, climate policy during this period. And basically, were 2 key questions. Which issues and topics motivated conservative columnists to write about climate change? and what types of arguments, or we call them counterclaims, do they use to challenge the seriousness of climate science and credibility. Here's what we did. I found this thing called townhall.com. I'm sure many of you are familiar with, if not all. It's an aggregator site for conservative columnists. So George Will, others, they publish their columns through their papers, but then they're posted at townhall.com. And it looks like about 90% of conservative columnists participate in Town Hall. It was set up in 1995, the first conservative web community. So what we did over these 4 years was search for, you just go through the columns, any column that mentioned global warming, climate change, anthropogenic climate change, anthropogenic global warming became a column that we would then look at in more detail. We ended up finding 203 articles. And by the way, so there were 59 in 2007, 37 in 2008, 57 in 2009, 48. So fairly continual pattern of interest. Now, again, we think this is a very important component of climate change denial to look at, because the top 10 conservative columnists are featured in 1,600, the data that we had. Newspapers have a total circulation of 96 million readers. George Will is #1, and at the time we came across a study that said he was listed in 460 papers. Now, 40 of the columnists we're going to look at published more than one op-ed. And here's the list. The top, you have a guy who kind of specializes in environmental issues, Paul Dreesen, not so well known perhaps. The ones in bold are listed as among the top 100 syndicated columnists in general, but in a 2000 study of Media Matters. So what you can see is a lot of these folks, Deborah Saunders, 11 columns, Walter Williams, 10, Jonah Goldberg, 8, Will himself, 8, Sewell, 7, Buchanan, 4, then you get some other people that you've heard of, and over here, some of these folks wrote a lot on climate change over this 4-year period, relatively speaking. Oh, I'm pointing the wrong way. Aha. I used this, and now, okay, I have them. A long. Ah, it did. Ah, okay, thanks. So here's how it looks. And again, I already gave you how, over the years. And basically what you see, some key events. So here is first Gore, An Inconvenient Truth, getting Academy Award and a Nobel Prize nomination. And then by the end of 2007, they actually get to Gore and the IPCC get the Nobel Peace Prize. This little blip is the first Heartland Conference, the sort of anti-climate change science conference. Then you kind of get a layoff here. We have the presidential, the primaries and the presidential election, climate change drops off. But here we go with ClimateGate and the Copenhagen COP kind of combined. Then we have a drop off, and this last one is another Heartland conference. That in between here, they got ignored, but right after Copenhagen, that one got attention, and then things have sort of slowed down. So what we did, we reviewed the columns just to get a sense of what was in there, and then we decided to try to focus on the key topics or issues and separated those into truly just the issues versus policy relevant issues. You'll see in here. Now, sometimes individual columns focused on more than one of these, but at the outset, here's what I really want to drive home. This is crucial. All 203 columns were critical of climate change or climate science or climate scientists. I mean, they're all dismissive critical. And it reflects, I think, the near hegemonic status of climate change denial among conservative elites these days. There's just nothing there. So here, separating them into topics and issues, Al Gore is the one side. They love to pick on Al Gore. So you can get rid of climate science by pointing out that Al Gore is fat and uses a lot of electricity or might want to run for president. And that's the nature of the argument. The IPCC, ClimateGate, of course, got quite a bit of attention, Oscars. So these were the big 5 issues that showed up. And then the policies, or anything policy relevant, we had Copenhagen, where we were trying to renegotiate Kyoto, of course, Kyoto throughout the years, cap and trade. What I found interesting, it was these more international issues that got 5 minutes. Okay, I'm getting close. Werner Lieberman, Waxman Markley even, which had actually passed the House, didn't get that much attention. And the theme is this incredible fear of international domination, of losing national sovereignty. They just found this idea that we would participate in some international accord truly despicable and so forth. Now, to examine the arguments they use to dismiss climate change or to deny climate change, dismiss climate science, we used 103 categories of skeptical arguments listed at this site, skepticalscience.com. And it actually, their categories bear resemblance to some categories that a ex-student of mine and I used in an early study of arguments posted on conservative websites, and scheme that Stefan Rahmstorf, the German climate scientist, used. He calls it trend, impact, and attribution denial. But basically what it is, they have a bunch of subcategories, but the top general one, it's not happening. Just deny that global warming is occurring. It's not us. Deny human contribution to climate change. It's not bad. If it should occur, actually it will be more beneficial probably. And finally, no need to act. The policies or treaties would be harmful to the US. Now, at skepticalscience.com, they keep adding new arguments that pop up. So we used 103 on January 1st, 2011, the day after our study ended, okay? And if you were to go there now, you would find a little more than 103. And I was afraid. I asked the secretary for help here. Okay. Yes. Can you, anyone, I apologize. But basically, it's not happening was the really big issue. There was, in fact, 320 of these arguments. The big ones would be there is no consensus among the scientists. They love that. It's cooling. It's not actually warming. And ClimateGate suggests ice isn't melting. ClimateGate suggests a conspiracy. Next is it's not us, 175. The biggies here, it's really the sun. Climate's changed before. It's natural. And over here, extreme weather. It's not caused by global warming, etc. Then you get 59 mentions of it's not bad, the top ones being this idea that climate sensitivity, where a whole lot of carbon is only going to change things a couple degrees, and that's really not going to affect the ecosystem. And then my plants and animals can adapt. All that worry about the polar bears, don't sweat it. And then it's too hard. Of course, the key is that doing anything will harm the economy, and it will hurt the poor. Coming from conservatives, I always find a very ingenious argument. So our analysis of these op-eds reveal important aspects of their role in the denial machine. Op-eds are often published in reaction to public events that appear to either legitimate, like the Nobel Prize, or denigrate, like ClimateGate, climate science. So they like to build off these things. The columnists focus more on Al Gore than any other topic over the 4 years. Easy Al, the target, okay? And easy target Al, I should have said. Columnists were more likely to discuss and criticize international policy proposals than domestic ones, and the most common arguments were those that either denied the existence of global warming or denied human responsibility. And finally, conservative columnists truly seem a key component of this climate change denial machine, especially the media, because they can reach such a wide audience. They're able to employ arguments against global warming that have been debunked. You might remember George Will wrote some awful columns that the scientists attacked, and the Washington Post didn't do a very good job with them. And thus, again, we see conservative columnists as filling an important niche in what a lot of us call the climate change denial machine. Thank you.
Do you want to load? I'll take care of loading it up. I noticed on the biography sheet that it says we're running from 1 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. I can assure it will be.
Holy
we'll be
smokes!
Done before then.
Yeah, if they'll bring in drinks, I could.
It's already loaded.
U.S. Contrarian or no?
Ah, that's it.
Let me get back where I can see this.
Okay, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Wilson Center and Megan Parker for organizing this talk. I'm going to discuss the paper that Riley and I wrote together on climate denial books. And so this is going to be kind of bare bones. There's some details that we can talk about in question and answers, but I'll give you some of the basics here. Some of it is in the background of, so in the context of our talk about science and connecting to policy, I really see climate denial as a function of reducing our ability to deal with serious risks as one important danger. So Mark Van Putten writes it this way, and also some mentions about the nature of U.S. environmental policy these days, and that is reflected here. The most perplexing feature of current federal environmental policy is that public attitudes, compelling science, and pragmatic solutions matter so little. Poll after poll demonstrates that the American people embrace environmental values and support stronger environmental protections. The mobilization of competent scientific expertise to speak with overwhelming consistency about environmental threats such as global warming and biodiversity loss is extraordinary and unprecedented. That's like, so in 2005, right? So the prospects of government leadership are grim. Gridlock appears to be the likely scenario. In our study, we attempted to look, and so the background here is that we published in 2008 a paper that looked at all English language books that dismissed, rejected really global environmental changes like biodiversity loss, stratospheric ozone depletion, and that kind of thing. And so what we did was we attempted to collect all of the books that we could find and attempt to kind of measure and categorize them. And the study on climate denial really grows out of this 2008 study. This paper in 2008 is available open access on environmental politics if you'd like to download it. And what we did was we found some really interesting trends. One was that the number of books that rejected environmental changes and environmental science claims to them really just exploded in the 1990s, specifically after 1992, which is during the Rio Summit, and 91 is the collapse of the Soviet Union, which changes the nature of the Cold War and the objectives of the conservative movement. The themes we found here were that environmental science was really junk, that it was environmental protection were lower priorities, and there was an anti-regulation, an anti-corporate liability theme, as well as a sense that environmentalism was a threat to Western progress itself. And you can see just the nature of these titles. And the ultimate trend here, the bottom line was that 92% of these books were connected to a conservative think tank, and it gave us the evidence that indeed this was a conservative movement, it's a conservative-led movement, and it was explained mostly by ideology. Also notice that the geographic trend is quite obvious, where the skepticism here is coming straight from the US with a little bit from the UK, primarily with trivial contributions from other countries. So this is an elite-led counter-movement. So a social movement typically agitates for change, and if that social movement threatens to be successful, a counter to that movement typically emerges, typically from elites, and that's what this is. So now moving to our ABS article, we take this, we look specifically to climate denial books. Also limited by just English language ones. Like we know that there are some missed that are in French, but by and large, we think we have a pretty good population here. This is also available for open access at the ABS website to download if you want. There. The way that we thought of denial, because you can imagine that there's some subjectivity in kind of describing this, reflects what Riley just mentioned in trend attribution, an impact. So it's not happening, it's not us, it's not bad. And then all of these kind of arguments lead up to a fairly unanimous kind of, well, almost a very strong, consistent message of don't do anything about it. That's also, some of this is available on the Yale Forum on Climate Change in the Media, if you for lay audiences to read who don't have access necessarily to, well, the ABS articles, open access to. Here we found was that there's a continued commitment from conservative think tanks in climate change denial books that are extending beyond what we studied in 2008. But there is, and there's a real dramatic increase in these books from 2000 to 2010, but the composition of expertise and authority changes in an interesting way I'm going to show you. And there's evidence of domestic, popular, and international diffusion that is moving from an elite-led counter-movement to one that's becoming more populist, at least in the United States, as well as spreading to some other countries. So in these books here, the Great Global Warming Blunder and the Politically Incorrect Guide to Global Warming, these are books that are published by normal press. So the PIG guides are produced by a conservative press. But these other ones, What Warming by Arno Arac and God's Day of Judgment, these are self-published books. And that is something that we found I'll talk about in a second. It's interesting. The burst of number of books is quite obvious, starting with 2007. That's the year, of course, the Nobel goes to Al Gore and the IPCC, and a number of other important things begin to happen there. But we see a real dramatic increase there. As climate science becomes more confident in many of its findings, you can see that it's really a political movement because it's responding politically, not really scientifically. And so that change in composition has to do with, so in this case, a description of the self-published versus other publishers, right? And this is a really interesting kind of phenomena. These days, now you can send a manuscript regardless of its quality. Some of these books don't even appear to be edited or read through. Simple, just bad writing, and you can send a file to lulu.com and they'll just put a cover on it, or they'll put a binding on it, right? So that's what these are. Oftentimes, these are just people from the lay public who have something that they want to say and they want to contribute to this counter movement, and attempt to reject the mainstream orthodoxy. And you can see that in the 1980s, the first decade, 1982 is the first book with I think it was Sherwood did so, and here we only had 5 books in the 80s that were rejecting the kind of mainstream climate position. Not very much interest there, and some self-published, all of which are connected to conservative think tanks. 1990s, mostly it's regular publishers, regular that is not self-published anyway. Almost all of these are connected to a conservative think tank as well. But what changes in the 2000s is that the proportion of self-published picks up in an obvious way, and the nature of connection to think tanks also changes. So in all the climate denial books, we see a decline from our 2008 study where we had 92% connected. This is 72%. So there's a decline in the intensity of involvement with the conservative think tanks. The sense here is that the elites and their leadership don't appear to be as needed in some ways. However, when you take out the self-published books, you get much closer to our original findings of 87% of these books being connected to and having affiliation with conservative think tanks. Again, as in most of the findings of just about every study that works on these dynamics, we have a conspicuous Anglo organization. That is, the Anglo group countries are the ones that make up the vast majority of these books, with the main proponent and the main source being the U.S., with to some extent the UK. So you can see here, we also were able to categorize the nature of authority. And in the beginning, you see a lot more natural science PhDs involved, and that declines. And then you see only about a third natural science PhDs. These are people like Patrick Michaels who have, authentic climate change related PhDs, but that concentration declines over time. So we broke this up into people who had natural science PhDs, other PhDs like political science like mine, and then just no PhDs. And you can see that the nature of that expertise really changes to the 2000s, where the majority are not PhDs at all. By nation, again, this is US, UK, and others. I got to finish up here. But 65% of these authors in general are not natural science, or don't have a natural science PhD. And the bottom line with all of these books is that the vast majority do not go through peer review. They're going through other outlets. And the ones that we thought could have been peer reviewed, because these through private publishers, you can't tell what the process looks like, at most would be 10% of these books. And some of those 10% I think are fairly dubious. We can talk more about that if you wish. And I'll end there.
Thank you. I'm going to respond to some of the points that Riley and Peter have made, and step back to ask this question. We've already talked about the Anglo-American dominance of this, and so I'm going to pose that question directly. I'm going to go in 5 steps. The first is there additional evidence that climate change skepticism and denial is most common in Anglo-American countries? I'm going to look at possible reasons for this Anglo-American predominance. Then I'm going to make a connection with American exceptional literature on American exceptionalism. Second to last, I'm looking at structural, sociological, and technological reasons for American climate change skepticism and denial. And then finally, in very broad terms, I'm going to talk about possible responses to American climate change skepticism and denial. So, is there additional evidence that climate change skepticism and denial is most common in Anglo-American countries? The answer is yes. I'm going to kind of breeze through it. James Painter has documented the prevalence in the media coverage of climate change. There is also survey evidence that suggests that public skepticism is higher in Anglo-American countries than other countries. And there are some studies of other developed country populations which show that the level of skepticism is significantly lower. And I'll return to this study near the end. Now, possible reasons for this, and I'm going to do this in very, very broad strokes. Obviously, economic self-interest could be part of it. The US and Canada show up among the top 15 producers for oil, natural gas, and coal. That's all 3 in 2011 and 2012. And in fact, the US is probably poised to be the top producer in oil and natural gas in 2013. More speculatively, there's an interesting study that suggests that the English language frames are thinking about the future in a particular way that would lead us to discount it more readily than some other languages. Obviously, the Anglo-American countries share a language. They also share a legal tradition, and this goes back to some comments and conversations from a professor I had when I was in graduate school, who suggested that there's a kind of a collectivist push under Roman law, which may also shape the Roman law versus common law, the way the press is treated in those countries, which may open up some options. And then finally, religion. And this takes us to American exceptionalism. We have to keep in mind that although the US is part of this Anglo-American group, as the figures that both Riley and Peter document about books and articles. It's much stronger here. And I would argue that this links back to the literature on American exceptionalism. A key work in this was by Seymour Martin Lipset in the 1990s. He described the American creed in 5 terms: liberty, egalitarianism, individualism, populism, and laissez-faire. And he attributed the particular kind of, or particular strain of individualism in the United States to the religious tradition. And this actually sounds more negative than he means it, I think, because of our sensitivity to the word sect. But he argues that the United States is the only country where most churchgoers adhere to sects, which are predominantly congregational. Each unit adheres voluntarily to the larger group. American Protestant sectarianism has both reinforced and been strengthened by social and political individualism. In other words, these are sort of implicitly anti-hierarchical religious groups, and I think one can read behind that they're not particularly interested in elite consensuses. And I think one could argue that there's a connection between the kinds of books that are being published and the sense that one has the authority to publish such books to this sense of American individualism. People have contested this, but even those who contest it wind up finding that on many variables, the United States is maybe on a continuum, but it's at the end of a particular continuum. There has been arguments back and forth about whether we should embrace American exceptionalism, and this is actually split both liberal and conservative. Most liberals would reject the notion of American conservatism, but not even all conservatives accept American exceptionalism. Which brings up a question. America is obviously not a single unified entity. So do we need to think in more regional or diverse terms about what do we mean by America? And there's been some interesting work on how one should think about the United States or North America in general, or Anglo-America in general. This is Woodard's map of the 11 nations of North America, or 11 nations of Anglo-America. This is a map plotting out the Republicans who signed the letter demanding that Boehner pass legislation defunding Obamacare, which shows some correlations with some of these divisions. But most of the literature on climate change denial is done on the basis of segmenting the population by views. This is Global Warming 6 Americas, the March 2012 version. This is the product of the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication and the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. This is how they visualize that. I think we do need to recognize that there are strong regional differences in where these views are articulated, and that I think is work that needs to still has to be done. Next, I want to just briefly talk about structural, sociological, and technological reasons for American climate change skepticism and denial. And here I'm just going to recapitulate what one of Norm Ornstein's colleagues at American Enterprise Institute dubbed the Mann-Ornstein hypothesis. This is based on their book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collides with the New Politics of Extremism. They start with the observation that the design of the US government creates quite often the possibility of divided government, which creates opportunities for leverage by outside parties. This is particularly true in the Senate, where we have, as a result of equal representation by all the states, dramatically unequal odds for election. They then note that over the last 30 years, either the procedural rules themselves or the use of procedural rules has further enhanced the leverage of opposing interests. Within the last decade, changes in campaign funding rules opened the process to outside influences. And then they make a comment about election laws, which were not particularly voter-friendly to begin with, are, when reformed, can be further discouraging for voters. So there's ways in which the landscape of political debate is made uneven by these developments, these structural elements. Finally, I would just highlight, and again, this goes back to the book publication, the prospects for self-publishing are made much easier with the advances in technology. We also now have, as was pointed out in the earlier panel, not 3 networks that, by virtue of being the only 3 networks available, keep us on the same page. We are now able to choose media that allow us to live in the America we choose to live in. And those can be very different Americas. So I would, in highlighting these factors, suggest that climate change skepticism and denial thrives in the United States because it has traction here. And it has traction here in ways it does not have elsewhere because of the structure of the government and the economy. So responses, and here I just want to pose a question, which is this climate change skepticism and denial a communication problem, or is it a process problem? If we're going to think about ways of responding to climate change skepticism and denial, should we focus on crafting better messages, or should we talk about correcting dysfunctions in the decision-making process? And I'm going to leave it there. Our next presentation is from Maya Lawson, sorry. And she is participating via a recorded PowerPoint. So we're going to have to turn the sound up.
Hello, this is Mariana Larsen speaking. It's a pleasure to be here, even if it's just virtually, and I thank you very much for the invitation. Title of my talk is Climate Change and Anti-Environmentalism. Is Brazil and... First of all, we see Brazil tops the charts in terms of climate worry and also the expressed willingness to sacrifice to preserve the environment. And there's a high concern also that climate change will negatively impact Brazilians. There's a sense also that Brazilians are really very aware of what the problems are based on these surveys. And so here's an article by Mark Langevin saying, while Brazilians by and large respect the science of climate change and understand the IPCC's conclusions, the US population is bitterly divided over the merits of the research. So Brazil seems like the nobler example. The same comes out in a report by Oxford University by James Painter, titled Poles Apart, in which he concludes, based on analysis of the mass media in 5 different countries, including the US and Brazil, says climate skepticism is largely a US phenomena and especially absent in developing countries. But beware, there's cross-national variation in the foci of anti-environmentalism. In Brazil, there's actually a very pervasive perception of environmentalism as a foreign plot. This is a quote from the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture, Cattle Raising and Supplies, a report from 2004, which portrays environmental concern, especially with focus on the Amazon, as a plot by foreign interests that is a plot intended to undermine Brazilian competitiveness on international markets. The same is still a discourse that's very strong. This is from Brazil's dominant, one of the dominant newspapers, Folha de Sao Paulo, a commentary by a regular columnist who is the strong, she's a senator, and she is the official defender of agribusiness in the Brazilian government, taking up the same trope of this interest in the Amazon, concern about deforestation and climate change. All of that is the focus of international, or an expression of international greed and an obsession of environmentalists who serve foreign NGOs. So a similar nationalist force focused on environmentalism as a plot. In Brazil, as is something also we see in the United States. But how does it look then? Let's look at the climate issue more specifically. And here I will show that climate change is approached as an opportunity in Brazil and that there's a erasure of issues that hurt. first you have to understand and look at how is Brazil positioned in the climate regime. It's a non-Annex I country with diplomats that have been very forceful and successful in framing the issue around historic responsibility for emissions and for bringing benefits to the country in terms of these mechanisms like the Clean Development Mechanism, REDD+, etc. Brazil also has a relatively low emitting energy matrix, which then means that it hurts less in terms of, and it has a very green image that it's been able to use precisely to project itself as this positive example on the world scene. But of course you also have economic interests that are very much aligned with the climate paradigm at the level of ethanol, and there's been a strong looking to and a promotion of biofuels as a solution for climate change and seen as an export opportunity for Brazil. So I've been doing a research looking at climate coverage, picking up all the articles in major newspapers, actually 3 or 4. This is a slide of 3 of the 4 newspapers I've studied. And so a selection of all the articles that mention climate change, and then this is a chart showing what are the major thematic foci of these articles. And it shows that all of the newspapers have as the strongest focus is on policy making. So climate change is something dealt with by diplomats, it's at the international level, it's related to Brazil at the level of economic interest. There's a strong focus also on biofuels. But when you look on the right side here, civil society and culture has almost nothing. And culture here includes like lifestyle. What does climate change mean for Brazilians' lifestyles? So that made me think, well, what would that be? So lifestyle in Brazil, if you look at the emissions profile, cattle production is responsible for half of Brazil's emissions. There's changes now because the energy is becoming a stronger sector in terms of emissions, but from the second last national inventory, it was a 15%. And yet, so here we see there's just a very strong reference. All the reference to consumption that I found in these articles were almost always around energy. So even though it's really a land use problem in Brazil, land use and agriculture being responsible for 80% of the emissions, it's the climate issue is approached and framed, discussed as an energy problem. Sorry, I should explain that better, but I don't have time. So this made me really interested in the previous slides. What you saw as that was red were references to anything that had to do with meat consumption, because that would be the obvious discussion if the national discussions were to reflect national emissions profile, and that's not the case. This is from the O Globo newspaper from 2012. These were all the references I found in the newspaper, in these climate change mentioning articles that would have anything that was vaguely critical of meat. The text in yellow is like eating less meat every day, per day, speaking vaguely about the environmental impact of meat production, but this amounted to very few words whole in that article. In that, this is the last column here, a total of 228 words. So there were 5 articles, but just those passages that I showed that actually discuss meat consumption in a critical way. So, and this was a pattern I found in all of the newspapers, and I'm still finalizing the in-depth analysis, but in-depth analysis shows that there's virtually a national taboo on discussion of meat production and meat consumption in the context of climate change as a problem. So here you can see critical of meat consumption in Folha de Sao Paulo 2007. There were 3 references. In the Estado de Sao Paulo there were 5, but the one in the parentheses after the 5 is that there's really, there were such vague references. There was really one that could really say was critical, and even that one is not an entirely article, and it's not an in-depth real explanation of what the problem is with meat consumption in the context of climate change or sustainability more broadly. And the last column, that was an interesting finding that come up with, that emerged from this, which is that it was actually as much coverage, as many references, and actually more words in many of the years devoted to refutations of criticisms of meat consumption. So those few critical mentions that I mentioned are actually counterworked already by a strong discourse against it. So in the case of Estado de Sao Paulo 2009, there were almost 2,000 words dedicated to the refutations of meat consumption criticisms, whereas there were just 400 words that were raising these criticisms in this vague way that I showed. And I found the same examples in other years for the Sao Paulo and global. So this is a national taboo. So, and the refutations then, are almost 5 times larger than the criticisms themselves. And so now what you do find is there advocation people saying there's a need to reduce deforestation, but there's very little probing past that to say what does it really mean, getting at the drivers and getting to these issues that hurt, like reducing the meat production and the consumption, which is a very valued part of the Brazilian diet. But there's also the elite interest that are behind this in terms of the mass media. An report out from Reporters Without Borders from this year calls Brazil the country of 30 Berlusconis and points out this very marked scenario in Brazil of concentration of ownership, which of course is not exclusive to Brazil. What is exclusive is that national landowners very often buy the local media, and they use the local media to project themselves into the federal government, where they then regulate their own media structures and give out the licenses, and there's no transparency, there's a lot of corruption, etc. So in this report by Reporters Without Borders, they talk about the incestuous relationship with the political and economic power centers, and that's reflected in the media concentration, and that these structures have not changed significantly since the dictatorship. There are other reports as well. So many media bosses are in the Brazilian Congress. Just mention quickly also that this lack of skepticism has actually changed since the James Painter report, but especially when it's convenient. So this was in the context of very strong national debates about revision to the Forest Code to weaken strong environmental regulations, which are not often well enforced, and this was a successful effort on the part of the agribusiness interest in Brazil so they managed to weaken it. And in that context, you saw a rise of very sympathetic coverage of climate skepticism. This is an article from the Equivalent Time magazine talking about the dogma is starting to melt, speaking about the scientific consensus on climate change. So in conclusion, contrarians are a symptom, they're not a cause of status quo and of inaction. Brazil has no strong contestation of climate change, yet its public is not better informed nor apparently closer to self-sacrifice compared to the US. There is still really a question of what does the Brazilian public really know and how does it really understand climate change. Because what we see is climate change is presented as an opportunity, at least in the printed media, as an energy problem, and where there's silence where it hurts. The Brazilian example is thus less noble and less different upon deeper analysis, and in some ways it's worse than other countries, in the sense that there's an even greater lack of transparency, there's a higher level of corruption, and there's a foreclosure of public debate higher up, such that you can say that in the US, at least, climate change is framed as an energy problem, which reflects its national emissions profile, whereas that's not the case in Brazil. Thank you very much.
Okay. Our last presenter is Rebecca Bertram from the...
And I don't have a PowerPoint.
I'm sure we're all relieved.
I'm not from academia. So I want to just respond quickly. We heard about Brazil and talk a little bit about the situation in Germany, where I can be very safe in saying that there's no organized political campaign discrediting climate science, not anything that is noteworthy. Rather, pro-environmental attitudes prevail in the cultural and political mainstream. How do we know that? Well, we have 5 bigger political parties in Germany. Each one of them is on board and accepts climate science as that's the truth. And in recent election campaigns, climate played it was no party that said, climate is not happening or we need to do less to save the climate. The large population of Germany is very concerned and thinks this is one of the biggest challenges of our times. We also have a different form of government, I think, which is instrumental in pushing this forward. We have a coalition government, making it less likely that extreme beliefs reach kind of the policy arena. And we also have a very deeply rooted precautionary principle that looks at whenever there's something new happening, we need to have some environmental impact assessment before going ahead. And that's, I think, is very different in the United States if you look at what's happening in the fracking business, where it's the other way around, really. So to sum up, climate skepticisms are a minority and have very limited level of influence. So why am I on this panel? Well, I think I would argue that I believe that the times are sort of changing a little bit. And they're changing with the energy transition that I talked about earlier today, where the country is really set on a pathway of about 80 to 90% renewables in the electricity sector. It's a low carbon strategy. We want to decrease our CO2 emissions by 95% compared to 1990 levels by the middle of the century. So it's really a very ambitious kind of target. And in a way, this was only possible, politically possible, because there is such popular consensus among the German public that this is an issue that we need to deal with, and we need to deal with it now. And it was Merkel's conservative government that came up with this, just as a side note. Now, 3 years into trying to change their narrative and become more skeptical of climate and energy policy rather than just skeptics of the science, they're less likely to deny climate science, and it plays a lesser role in their repertoire. It no longer focuses on science but on policies, which, as we all know, is debatable. So what we're seeing is that policies tend to be criticized in an increasingly ideological way. We're talking about threats to eco-socialism, eco-dictatorship. There are fears being brought forward of a green revolution from the left. And all this is spreading really fears about how we continue to live our lives. It creates a new audience and a new alignment opportunities for this originally small climate skeptic group. What we are seeing is that these guys focus more on attacking the energy policy and the energy transition rather than going after the international climate negotiations, which happen every year and are seen as kind of a instrument to never really come to any breakthrough results. So it's not really seen as that important to them to be attacked. And with attacking the energy policy and the energy transition comes a new power struggle into play. It is now the big power interests, big industries, big utilities, to a certain extent also nature conservationists that fight against the buildup of renewable energy sources in Germany. So they fight against co-ops, individual citizens who make money from renewable energy installations and who are thus benefiting from it. This has created new outreach opportunities for this sort of skeptical group. It's creating greater access to policymakers because the strong traditional fossil fuel lobbies have traditionally had very strong ties in lobbying government. It has a result that research institutes and think tanks have had to take this narrative seriously in a way that they never really had to do before. And there's a lot of money in this fight, suddenly. The media plays a big role in it. We don't have the bipolar kind of media set. It's sort of all sort of mainstream. You have a couple of extremes, but there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a lot of money being put in to kind of discredit what is going on with false messages and stuff like that. One of the key arguments that they use is they see energy transition as a too costly measure to combat climate change. They they see that Germany, or they argue that Germany needs to maintain a strong industrial base, and they don't really take the notion of a green economy very seriously. And then third, and somewhat paradoxical, they alert us to the fact that at the moment and short term, yes, emissions in Germany are rising. But it's sort of strange that the people who really climate skeptics and big fossil fuel lobby would argue with that argumentation. So as I said, like today, there's not one day when this topic isn't in the media. It's amazing. It's the first time I've seen a topic even debated this hotly as this, and it's because there's a lot of interest. The utilities are fighting for their survival, which is very interesting. Manufacture uncertainties, somewhat that ties us back into what, the climate science. You hear one thing for one day, then something else the next day. So looking forward, Germany had elections in September. They're now forming a government, a coalition government, and it's probably going to be between Angela Merkel's Conservative Party and the Social Democrats. And they need to really sort out some of these problems to make the energy policy less attackable than it is now, because it's just basically feeding this new, bigger, powerful group in Germany with the, they're making themselves very prone to criticism as it is now. So essentially, to sum it up and just tie it in how it fits in with the US debate, the main difference, I think, between Germany and US is that in the US arguments, we argue whether climate change is happening or whether it's real or man-made and all of that. In Germany, that stage has sort of passed a little bit, and we're now debating on how best to solve the problem. And I think that's at the heart of the matter, where Germany stands now.
Okay. So that we don't leave Rebecca stranded at the end there, I'm going to move.
I was told to.
I'll open up the floor for questions in a moment. I did want to direct one question to Rebecca. I know that the Heinrich Böll Foundation has efforts to promote the energy transition within the U.S. And this consists of, could you talk about those efforts and what's the rationale behind those efforts?
We are executing a German foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
We get funded by the German government. The German government has an interest in getting other parts of the world moving forward. I mentioned earlier, I think, saying that Germany alone doing all this would have no impact on the climate whatsoever. So getting those messages across, sharing learning experiences, sharing best practices, that is sort of at the heart of the issue. We do less convincing and talking about climate skepticism. We try to frame the narrative in a more positive way.
Mm-hmm. And I think in the earlier panel, you also said that you were not going to Congress, but going to states.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
yes. So that's just our strategy, and I've been in DC for 2 years now, and it's just reinforcing how it's also more interesting for someone like me to go into like the other areas, which are pretty amazing, and I love that part of my job.
We'll open the floor for questions. Go ahead.
Donald Barnes, South China University of Technology. You've done a very good job of laying out many of the factors that are behind all this. I wonder if I could probe a bit more on two aspects that one you mentioned, the other you did not mention.
Okay.
The first one was religion. What is your take on how this became a religious issue and why it came out the way it did? Because one might think that taking care of God's creation would put them in favor of global climate change issues, but I think it's being played out the other way. How did that happen? And the other one is the old question of follow the money.
Mm-hmm.
Where is this support coming from, and what might that mean?
First, let me clarify the point about religion, and I'm going to do this by drawing an analogy. I, for another project, read an article recently that looked at, this is a grisly topic or title, but the visibility of disaster deaths in news media. And the author argued came in with a hypothesis that he expected to find more more visible deaths in Catholic countries than in Protestant countries. The argument was that the iconographic tradition of Catholicism was much more explicit than that in Protestantism, and that would rub off even on secular photojournalists, that they were just raised in an environment that had a particular set of norms to it. And the point about the religion in that context was that there's a stance toward authority and there's a stance toward individual autonomy in this particular kind of American religion that I think one can see in the op-ed pages where someone just dismisses the scientific consensus and kind of says that I can reason it through on my own. I don't need to sort of kowtow to that consensus. So I'm I know of the studies about the scientific consensus, promoting the scientific consensus as a lead in to positive public opinion about climate change. I'm not sure how hardy that is, how much that would stand up to opposition. Clearly different religious groups have taken different stances on the issue per se. We also haven't talked about sort of the growing polarization in the United States, which I think is even forcing religious groups which might be sympathetic to it to sort of choose sides with the larger issues involved. I'm not sure if I've answered that question, but I'm going to stop there on that one. As for the money, my point would be that you still have to have a political structure where that money can be put to effective use. And clearly, a lot of money has been spent in the United States, but I think the relationship between the media, the public, the industry, and government in the United States gives that money more traction here than somewhere else. That would be my point.
Could I comment? It's hard to document, although there will be an article coming out very shortly in Climatic Change by Robert Brule that tries to look at the funding of what we call the anti-climate change counter movement. And of course you have a lot of, quote, dark money, donors trust in this that hides it. But in general, I think the evidence, with a broad brush, in the late 80s, clearly ExxonMobil, the Western Fuels Association funded Pat Michaels, et cetera. I think the bulk of the money probably at the outset came from fossil fuels industries. But over time, we've seen this shift away from corporate America to the core conservative movement, and especially conservative foundations. So I believe the evidence does suggest that the Koch brothers we hear so much about, but other foundations, Bradley Foundation and some of those, that it's not fair to talk about corporate America. These folks made their money in corporate America and continue to do so, the Koch brothers. But as climate change has become more of an ideological issue, and much of corporate America, more progressive, hasn't challenged climate science, et cetera. I think the funding has really come from conservative foundations and the real hardcore conservative capitalist.
I found both presentations on denialism extremely interesting. Actually, all the presentations were very interesting. And I hope that the content of your presentations might be available so that some of us can try to spread the word, and perhaps those summaries that you mentioned that were online at the Yale site would be sufficient. If they're not, if it's possible to get copies of the PowerPoint presentations, that would be extremely helpful. Nobody has mentioned ALEC, and so I want to just bring that up because I think it's very relevant. So I don't know if everybody in this audience is aware, but ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. And it is a group that has presented itself as a kind of legislative think tank. And engaged many legislators in state houses, especially around the country, in interest, gaining their interest in the publications that they have produced. And it is also funded by, conservative think tanks. And they managed to get buy-in from a large number of corporations. So that included, for a while, Coca-Cola and Colgate-Palmolive and Johnson & Johnson and Walmart and, et cetera, very mainstream large corporations. And then it became understood that ALEC's agenda was putting together a variety of issues that united a number of conservative causes and, was sort of an unholy alliance, if you will, of NRA, pharma, those who were defending the oil interest, the bad corporate oil actors like the Koch brothers, and those who were anti-contraception. And, each kind of pursuing, and pharma was in there because they were talking about reducing liability, the potential for liability suits. And when it became known, so they were promoting stand your ground legislation. There was a publication called the EPA's Regulatory Trainwreck, which was basically debunking regulation, environmental regulation. They were fighting against the health reform bill, and so there was a lot of obstructionist recommendations with regard to keeping health reform from moving forward. And there was an agenda, each piece of which basically got the backing of another one of the major pieces. And I just want to mention that, it became known and realized that this was going on. And so little by little, the corporate interests withdrew. So Walmart withdrew, Colgate-Palmolive withdrew, Johnson & Johnson withdrew. Many of the large, I mentioned Coca-Cola, many of the large corporate backers understood that this was really a conservative agenda that was masquerading as a mainstream legislative think tank. And as that became understood, so I would say that what you presented here really needs to be available
let's
to the
get
public.
some answers or responses to your question.
Well, first, two things. Number one, the article on conservative think tanks and books is available in the domain. I forked out $1,500 from my, and I have an endowed chair that but anyway. So to make that available, and if you go to the American Behavioral Scientist, it's just there for anyone to use. The other articles should be, if you can't get access to a university library, send me an email. Also, in fact, I have a 6-page bibliography now of work on climate change, skepticism, and denial. I'd be happy to share with anyone. I just would real quickly add, one of the things that has amazed me as I've got more and more interested in the conservative movement's impact with Peter on environmental skepticism in general, climate change, is the amazing way in which the American media has facilitated the conservative movement. There was, until quite recently, no investigative journalism on ALEC. They've been outed now, so to speak. So people shy away from them. But it's quite amazing as an academic to see how conservative think tanks are treated as an alternate academia. You get these people with Cato, Competitive Enterprise, Heritage. They're paid full time. They don't teach. They don't have to chair dissertations, and they sure don't have to go to terrible faculty meetings and so forth and committees. They're just paid to turn this stuff out. And yet they are treated consistently in newspapers, TV, radio, as some kind of experts, as objective. And it's so common to say, we have a panel here today, and Dr. So-and-so from Harvard and Dr. So-and-so from the Heritage Foundation, as if the rather objective scientist and this basic propagandist somehow have equal credentials and objectivity. And I'm just stunned that American journalism keeps giving this naive view of conservative think tanks. We need to dig below the surface. ALEC is just one example. A second example, and a new report just came out. Conservative funders have set up conservative think tanks in virtually, I think it's 49 of the 50 states, and they're often very active on the state level. And the American public just doesn't hear about this stuff. And it's stunning to me.
There's a question in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. Jerry Miller. I'm president of Science for Decisions, and I have two questions. The first of which may have a simple yes or no answer. The second may elicit a little more discussion. And the first is directed primarily to Riley and Peter. And the question is, we've seen very good presentations today on what, if I use the politically incorrect term, might be what the enemy is doing. And so I'm left to wonder what the allies are doing. Has there been any analysis of how the media has treated the other side of the equation? If there is, I'd like a pointer to those analyses. The second question is perhaps best addressed to Rebecca, and I wish Miana were here as well. And it has to do with analogies between developments in Brazil and developments here in the US. The similarities aren't perfect, of course, but in some ways, Brazil and its economy today is similar to what the US looked like in the post-World War II era. Brazil has an expanding middle class, for instance. We now have a contracting middle class. There are several facets of our two countries that we could discuss in that way. And I wonder if there might be some lessons to be learned from those trends that could be applied productively here in the U.S. And I point that towards Rebecca in Miana's absence, since she perhaps is looking at the U.S. from the point of view of someone who is sitting outside of the U.S.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you.
we'll let Peter and Riley handle the first question while Rebecca thinks of an answer for the second.
You know, I'm not exactly sure how to answer the question directly, but oftentimes when I give this talk, there's a like the question comes, well, isn't the pro climate change side just the same thing? You know, there's a political movement behind the the kind of the groups that support the orthodoxy, right? And of course, part of that is true in the sense that there is a political movement, there's a social movement to gain more traction for mitigating climate change. So, for example, with Bill McKibben's 350.org, you know, obviously is a social, it's part of a broader social movement that's working towards addressing climate change, which happens to be supportive of the mainstream orthodox climate science. But on the other hand, the difference is that in order to get the orthodox climate science, I don't have to watch Al Gore's movie. In fact, I've never seen it. It's kind of probably scandalous to admit, but I just don't need to, right? I don't need to go there. But if you want to look at the contrarian side, you want to look at the climate denial, you have to go to these conservative sources. Yeah. That's the only way you're going to get that information. So if you want to know the orthodoxy and you don't want to engage, you know, the social movement, the environmental groups, you could go to, for example, the American Physical Society. You could go to the American Geophysical Union. You could go to the AAAS site. You could go to any number of science groups that have made now declarative statements about the consensus position.
Or you can go to Science Magazine, Nature Magazine, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
I do think we get in a problem, and that's that false equivalence of, you know, we got this side and that side. And while, as Peter accurately put out there, we do have Bill McKibben, an activist. I mean, one side is mainstream climate science, and it's the National Science Foundation, NASA, NOAA, you know, that have very rigorous peer review, leading journals and so forth. And what you have on the other side, you know, they want to play this off, so they try to create an alternate science, which, you know, the Heartland people point out. But unless you believe in conservative science and liberal science, which I think is taking, you know, false equivalence to the extreme, the two sides aren't balanced. That's what I'm trying to say. Just because you have some activists like McKibben, you still have the anchor is mainstream science, and the other side simply doesn't have that. So it's hard to do comparable analyses. I mean, if I were going to analyze, you know, climate science, I could look at EDF and Bill McKibben's group, but they're not. I'm more interested in what NSF funds and, you know, what gets published in mainstream journals, things like that. But
One idea to your question, and I'm not drawing this on Brazil in any way whatsoever. Please excuse that. But one of the things that I feel is a real hindrance to having a political discussion in the United States around energy and climate issue is the lack of a third political force, a third political party that will kind of take away and kind of open the states for a more open discussion around these things. That's why when I was starting to talk about Germany, it was so clear that we have 5 main political parties. We have coalition governments where compromise is very much part of our political system, and allowing for these extremes not to really materialize. And I think so. That's just one of my thoughts. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's one of the things that I've been thinking about. Oh, wouldn't it be great if the Tea Party would split off? You know, like kind of getting a third movement in there.
James Sang, one big question, one little question. The big question relates to how Americans look at expertise. As you pointed out, the 60s and 70s were an unusual period, but it's also the period after World War II and the atomic bomb and the start of the space program and Sputnik. And so expertise was actually riding fairly high in the 60s and 70s, whereas one could argue that before the 50s, you could have Richard Hofstadter writing anti-intellectualism, and that in certain respects, are we seeing a reversion to the mean from the 60s and 70s to now? And that's a big question. The little question to Rebecca is, can you tell me where we stand right now in Germany on the decommissioning of nuclear plants with respect to increasing carbon emissions and stuff like that?
I had a slide at the end of my presentation, which I decided to cut because I just didn't have the time, that looks at the polarization of the Senate in the United States from 1890 to the present. And it is now, according to this analysis, which uses the DW nominate system, the U.S. Senate is essentially equal to the House in terms of the degree of polarization. And it is more polarized than it has been at any time in the last 100 years. The one time when the two parties came closest together was World War II and coming out of World War II. That's also the time period when we have the 3 networks sort of delivering a sort of a common message to the American public. We then quickly became, I think, embroiled in arguments about what that common message should be. But one could make the case, I think, as you implied, that the period from the end of, the beginning of the New Deal to 1970, 1980 is an exception to the rule of American politics. And I think we'll have to see what happens. But, yeah.
I want to just, on the science part in particular, I like to draw a distinction that was introduced by a late colleague, sociologist Alan Schneeberg, between impact science and production science. The idea of production is the typical, big physics, chemistry thing, biotech, biochemistry that leads to innovations, new products, new technologies, and ultimately more profit. Republicans have been, up until quite recently, were gung-ho on production science. But what we saw from Rachel Carson on is what he calls impact science. And increasingly, we have ecologists and others out documenting the negative and often unintended consequences of growth capitalism, if you will. And I think what we see in the anti-science efforts of conservatives is basically an attack on impact science. And if a colleague and I wrote a piece on this in a journal called Theory, Culture, and Society that uses this distinction as a way of trying to shed insight on the conservative attack on it. But I think we simply can't talk about science. What the people doing genetic engineering and so forth versus the people out studying toxic waste, they're greeted very differently. And the Republicans and conservatives aren't so concerned about the former, but the latter they'd like to shut up.
I'd like to add to that too, is that even when we poll the American public without breaking them up into too many Americas, is that there's tends to be a general regard for scientists, and there's a different regard for different scientists, and I was thinking about the production science too in particular, but this also leads, I think, to one of the problems in the sense that because the American public perceives that there is a division in the halls of science, because so they think typically that scientists themselves disagree about the basics of climate change. So even if the American public tends to think that climate change is something that is serious and needs to be addressed, they look to this perceived division and think, well, wait a minute, maybe we better let these guys work it out first, even though that perception is absolutely wrong. And this leads to what I call a science trap. That is that the public cannot discern between an authentic debate in science and a manufactured debate outside of science, in part because a lot of these the halls of science are the journals and the conferences that most people just don't have access to. So it's not it's not an indictment. It's just a democratic problem. And of course, then there is also the issue of the impact versus production science that Riley was talking about, and I think that kind of gets to some of the problems that the kind of the skeptics and the conservative movement are really concerned about at its base, because as Paul Sears noted, by its very nature, ecology affords a continuing critique of man's operations within the ecosystem, and if taken seriously as an instrument for the long-run welfare of mankind, it would endanger the assumptions and practices accepted by modern societies.
Let me just add one point to that, which is Mayana Lawson's article.
I always thought it was Lawson, but it sounded like she. I've met her many times. I don't know. Maybe she's never pronounced her name in front of us. So Lawson, Mayana.
Her article in this collection is about the three physicists who were the sort of the core early climate change skeptics. And what was interesting about that is you had people who had worked in the bomb program and then in nuclear engineering. And they dismissed the early work on climate scientists because it had to run on computer models. And the way that they dismissed them was by talking about them as they're not scientists, they're engineers, which I found ironic for three bomb builders and people involved in nuclear engineering to be dismissing someone as an engineer. But you have that kind of dispute or the split between the productive science and the impact science. Other.
Thank you. Philip Allen.
It was on.
Thanks. A couple of remarks just on a previous pairing of questions, religion and money. The embroilment of science with religion goes back a long way in American social history. We all know that. But the perfect analogy, or nearly perfect analogy, would be with creation, so-called creation science versus evolution, and you can conceive how sort of extreme religious ideologies were quite prepared to attack climate science after all of the battles that have been fought in the last decades. Secondly, on financing, I'm wondering if it's a naive distinction between industrial support for the skepticism and conservative ideologies and the think tank foundation support, since I think the money probably comes from the same place.
Yeah.
But I do have a question.
Okay.
And it is, it occurs to me, and I may be wrong, that literature, including popular literature, film and television and so on, has not taken up the climate question, climate change question, in nearly the same way that it did and still does questions of pollution, of the environment, women's rights, gay rights, and so on. And that perhaps the American public will not be prepared to see what is really in front of most of our faces until we get it through some form of art. And I'd like, as a patron of the arts, I'd like to see that. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't dispute. Your point about trying to separate the funding is very clear. And again, the Koch brothers make their money, through their corporations. But what I'm saying is, it seems like from early support of the National Association of Manufacturers, et cetera, that the funding has shifted increasingly to a smaller group of people who have made their fortunes via corporations and and the Koch brothers, private companies. But it's an increasingly small segment that is extremely ideological. And so you don't get Nike and Microsoft and those folks, partaking in this. We don't want to say corporate America. I think we have to be more specific. But trying to really separate that out is difficult.
Peter?
I'm sorry. I'm Julie Hantman. I'm an independent public health consultant. I'm a parent of a young child, concerned about it as well. This follows on that question because what I'm hearing is that there is a growing thought that the cultural piece of this is maybe a key answer, and that it needs to osmose into the culture, at least the culture of those within the 6-part taxonomy toward the middle and left of the issue, because I don't think there is one culture. But aside from art and literature champions, and I spoke with Dilly about this a little on the break, where, as there were in AIDS, where are the cultural champions, the people who are well known like Oprah, or where is the efforts to outreach to people to get them to take on this issue? And where is there a place for that in the sociological or in your paradigm? And can that have the sort of power to sort of work against the sort of paradigms you're talking about? Maybe allied with this is the thought I came out of the first session with, which I've known for some time. I and others want to mobilize more publics to join with environmentalists, right? This has to be a human movement, not an environmental movement, in my view. But you can't talk to them too much about it till you say, here's something to do, which is what some of the folks were saying before. And what to do other than online petitions and rallies, which tire people and annoy them and bore them. What is there to do? We need to do more like what you're doing in Germany, opportunities for people in communities, et cetera. And I think that also is part of the cultural movement we need, civic action and creative ideas at the local level. And there is some of that in this country. But how do we see all that kind of coming together?
Rebecca, could you talk to the role of climate change in popular culture in Germany, or literature, or?
No.
It would be interesting to do a tally of, and I can kind of imagine this in my head because I owned a bookstore for many years and I could tell you what was showing up on the shelves. There have been a number of novels that touched on climate change in some way. Barbara Kingsolver, I think, did one recently. I don't know whether the number of those novels, it certainly doesn't rival feminism, no question about that. I don't know whether the number of novels that would be considered sort of early environmental responses to the degradation of the environment, whether that is a bigger number than we've seen on climate change. There was a kind of a popular culture peak around 2008, 2009, but the wind seemed to go out of the sails after Copenhagen. I think the premise of action on climate change may have to shift away from the international negotiations to something else that can develop its own momentum, because clearly the momentum isn't there at the international agreement level. But you had I think Vanity Fair ran 3 green issues, and then I think after 2009 they just gave up. You do have films. You do have people coming in. I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio was active in some ways. Matt Dillon was active in some ways. Matt Damon. So it's out there, but yeah, we seem to have run out of steam, and I don't know what the next step would be. I think we might have time for one more question. Let's to you.
My question has to do. Thank you. My question has to do with the findings that climate change denial is largely an Anglo country phenomenon, and I want to find out what studies have been done, if you know of them. I've seen just one, I think, about how different ethnicities within the U.S. view climate change, and what have you seen any parallels between that and at the global level, and what are the implications for that?
I didn't understand. Within the U.S., are you talking about the 6 Americas?
No, are you aware of studies about different ethnicities, not the global warming 6 America, which is a...
Ethnicities. I missed that.
Yeah.
Yes, on average, non-whites are more concerned.
Okay.
But we need more non-whites in America. No. Immigration and climate change are inherently linked. No, actually, I mean, I don't know how many of you are familiar, but anybody who works in risk, you might know there's a long tradition of studies on the, quote, white male effect.
Yeah.
And it turns out that white men are very unique. They just don't worry about risks to the extent that everyone else does. So Aaron McCright, my colleague at Michigan State, and I, who have published things on political polarization on climate change, decided to marry these traditions, and we wrote a piece in Global Environmental Change a while back called Cool Dudes, the rejection of climate change among white conservative males. And so you do get this very distinct pattern that is a segment of the American public. And there's a lot of, why? Well, white males benefit most from the status quo, the traditional system, et cetera, but I think that we do need more work along these lines. And I just want to come back on that prior question. It's really hard. How do we deal with white males, but more broadly mobilize? This is where we get a difference between toxic waste, AIDS, even gender discrimination. The psychologists in particular have given us a lot of insights on climate change. And we know that problems that are distant in the future, problems that seem, global, they're diffuse, they're not right here, that the more geographically and temporally distant things are, the more difficult it is to get people really worked up about them, to mobilize them. So I think we really have our work cut out. And this is, one of the other big findings over above ethnicity is, on average, younger people are more concerned, as they should be, about climate change. So what to do? I know. I just diagnose. I try to analyze the problems. I thought you media folks and whatever gotta.
Let me just. It's a kind of a strangely negative, positive note to end on, but the last Pew Research survey to come out, I think, located the most intense skepticism about climate change within the Republican Party, within the Tea Party.
Yeah. Yep.
The Tea Party is also, to coin a phrase, the group of Republicans who are also most likely to embrace debt limit skepticism and denial, which really scares people. And I think if debt limit skepticism becomes closely aligned with climate change skepticism, that may move people off of that.
But to come back to the money thing, we're seeing again the kind of a lot of mainstream corporate America is now funding anti-Tea Party because the responsible parts of corporate America know that. I just can't resist. I have to make one other local denial thing. It's because the debt denial is a great example of the movement into what I think the conservative echo chamber creates, and it's an alternate reality. But you might also remember the poll denial Going into the last presidential election, there were a lot of conservatives that said, no, those pollsters are liberal. They're biasing this, trying to discourage us. I happen to work with Gallup for a long, long time. They're not conservative, trust me. And they're professional pollsters. And what I found fascinating was some local amateur conservative decided he needed to adjust the polls for this liberal bias. And he set up a website and he modified those, just like Anthony Watts of What's Up With That, the most widely known denial site, is always trying to modify. He says the stations that measure temperatures are biased, urban heat islands, etc. And in both cases, you have amateurs coming along rejecting what the professionals are doing and adjusting. And, you know, as Karl Rove demonstrated to us that night, if you happen to catch that wonderful segment when he was on Fox, it got replayed, he just couldn't believe that Romney lost Ohio. I mean, he was in disbelief. So I like to really draw analogies because I think it's very good. What underlies all of this, and I find so scary, is a movement a substitution of ideology for reality and the creation of alternative realities. And with the debt limit, with climate change, it's very scary. But with the polling, their balloon got punctured quickly. But it's the same kinds of people, the same forces at work.
You know, that reminds me, and your comment about the different perspectives from different ethnic groups, is that, you know, our research shows that while climate denial has become more populist, it is still an excruciatingly narrow view, from an excruciatingly narrow perspective, which probably opens up important political opportunities across broad sections of the United States.
Any final remarks, Rebecca?
I keep thinking here about framing and narratives, and I just wanted to end up with a positive story from Georgia. Some of you may have heard about this, where the Sierra Club is cooperating with the Tea Party to allow for solar panels to be built up on private rooftops. And it's just getting people together that are concerned about different things, but suddenly pushing for the same solution is a way to drive this forward as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I hope you will join me in thanking our panelists and congratulating them for ending 12 hours ahead of schedule.
And thank you folks for staying and having so many interesting questions.
Thanks, Michael. That's pretty great.